Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
Emily didn't say a word. It's free. She heard a woman's voice bring her back to reality. Yes, the girl replied absent-mindedly and set her bag on the floor. An older woman sat next to her hands folded in her lap. She sighed sadly as the train started and took them forward through the gray spring landscapes of fields and forest. The passengers got to talking on the way, and after entering the city, Emily helped an elderly woman carry her heavy bags to the bus stop. She had come from the village to visit relatives, but no one had met her. Emily looked sadly at the departing bus. She felt sorry for the lonely old woman, though she was no less lonely herself. At least she had a place to go. And the girl in this city, no one would give her a corner for nothing. However, such travels through the cities of the region, one could say, had already become a habit during the last months when she was traveling in search of income and housing. She was hired to work at markets selling vegetables and fruit, as a dishwasher, at least for the time of sick leave and short vacations, as a janitor. And if she was lucky, a miner. She didn't stay anywhere for long, and she was glad of any opportunity to get some money to pay for room and board. Even that seemed a good life compared to what she'd had before. Still in her nightmares, she saw the endless field, the searing sun that made dark spots appear before her eyes, and her aunt's, "Who else would want you but me? Yeah, anyone would have kicked you out on the street a long time ago," her squeaky voice echoed in my head. "Next stop," announced the conductor, and the childhood memories dissipated. She went in search of work at the warehouses, car washes, and gas stations on the outskirts of town. Among them were diners where she could also try her luck. My shoes were soaked, my bag was weighing down on my shoulders, but there was nowhere to go. She had to find something for the day, otherwise she would be homeless tomorrow. Mostly they refused politely and quietly. But at one of the car washes, the receptionist, for some reason, took her for a beggar and shouted in front of the other employees, "Get out of here. It's fashionable to walk around. I will not give you any work. You'll steal something else or worse." The driver, who had come to pay, looked at Emily, and she felt very uncomfortable. He was holding a cup of coffee in a paper bag with a brownie he'd just bought at the local buffet. The girl hadn't eaten anything since this morning. "Sorry," she hurriedly said, and quickly walked outside. It felt like she had just been doused in slop. How she hated her poverty at this moment. And she was not asking for alms, but wanted to earn an honest living. "Can I give you a ride?" came a man's voice from somewhere. "What?" Emily was confused. "And if you can, that would be great. Get it." It was the same man she'd run into at the car wash. A few minutes ago, driving by, he had stopped and looked out the open window. Once inside the car, Emily felt uncomfortable for the second time. The interior was clean, modern, and smelled very pleasantly of fragrance and expensive men's perfume. The girl even looked shyly at the driver and pondered to herself why he had stopped. Pity, an unpleasant thought flashed through her head. "Where do you want to go? To the nearest hostel of some kind, the cheapest one?" the man asked. The man turned on the navigator and used it to find the right address. Emily was angry at herself for having bypassed so few organizations and was afraid that tomorrow she would suffer the same fate. "Are you looking for a job?" the new acquaintance asked, either noticing the passenger's sad face or just out of politeness. "Yes," she replied faintly. "And what do you do for a living?" he asked, pulling up outside a gray, unassuming building labeled hostel. "Clerk, dishwasher, basically, whatever they'll take." "Thank you very much." She was about to leave, but the man suddenly perked up. "Do you have a medical book?" "Yes, my name is Jason." He held out his hand. "And I'm Emily," she replied, a little surprised. "Emily, if you're looking for a job, why don't you go as a dishwasher at a restaurant? I have an employee who left unexpectedly due to illness, and the season is about to start. And there's a lot to do. Looking for someone new is always a problem." "Oh wow," Emily was completely confused. "Interesting. Write down my number. Come back tomorrow for an interview." "I don't have a phone. I'll write it down on a piece of paper." Jason dictated the address and left. Emily paid for a place in the hostel for the night, showered, and snacked on the bun she'd kept in her bag all day to eat when she got unbearably hungry. Finally, she crawled under the covers. Luckily, the room was barely occupied, and the two roommates were lying quietly in their beds, staring into their phones. And why would he do that? Emily asked herself, stroking her stomach. Her thoughts darted from one extreme to the other. At first, the girl was sure the man was a con artist, tricking naive fools into doing something illegal. Why? I only told him about the phone. Now he'll think that no one will even look for me in case of anything, she chastised herself. Then she suddenly imagined a beautiful, clean restaurant where the food smelled warm and delicious. She wanted to go there and eat to her heart's content with that pleasant feeling. The image of the casual acquaintance changed dramatically. Now he seemed like a kind and helpful person. Maybe he really needs a dishwasher urgently. He felt sorry for me and found out that I was looking for just such a job. So he offered it to me. What's the big deal? It's worth a shot. After all, washing dishes in a restaurant is still better than selling at the market. But think about it, she continued her inner dialogue as she fell asleep. She was determined that tomorrow she would go to the address and try to get a job. The morning was rainy and overcast. Her shoulders and legs were aching unpleasantly after yesterday's adventures. Emily, hello. Jason greeted her as she entered his office. Come on in, have a seat. Hello. Emily replied, once again feeling awkward. Her companion was sitting in his chair with his legs apart, the top buttons of his white shirt undone, and she noted to herself that he was quite handsome. Ready to get started in the next few days. I have a lot of guests in my kitchen right now. See, the thing is, I'm pregnant. There was a momentary pause, but it seemed to Emily that Jason had been silent for too long, and she was about to get up and leave. He didn't seem to be thinking of kicking her out, though. So let's do it this way, he said seriously. I'll give you a month's salary in advance so that you can rent a room for the first time. Don't refuse. I need a responsible employee, and without a permanent home, you're unlikely to do a good job. Emily didn't know how to respond. It was rare that anyone cared about her. So now it was hard to hold back tears, so much so that she was touched by her future boss's behavior. Jason did give her the money, and she rented a room near the restaurant. After getting to know the staff, Emily began her duties. Despite the constant bustle in the kitchen, she enjoyed washing dishes. She seemed to be the most cheerful in this new company. The cooks and waitresses often complained about their paychecks and lack of days off. But it's not like they were wandering around town with one bag looking for some part-time work for fear of being left on the street. Emily shrugged, smiling. The only person who disliked the new girl was the receptionist, Paul. This short, chubby man with a round face, which almost always lit up with a friendly smile, for some reason began to pick on her from the first minute. Appearances rest less often and work more. He remarked as he passed by as she took a seat in a chair. At that moment, his smile seemed venomous and mocking to her. And what did I ever do to him? Emily sighed, pacing home. Her whole body felt immensely tired. The only way to eat a good dinner was at work. So all she wanted to do on the way home was fall on her bed and sleep until morning. Oops, someone behind her nudged her. Where are you from, baby? There was a small white puppy sitting at the entrance to the supermarket with red spots on his sides and a thin tail that dangled cheerfully from side to side. Emily stroked the puppy's head and went inside. When she left the store, she bought a bag of dog food just in case. Her worst fears were realized. The little boy was sitting on the sidewalk nearby, as if waiting for someone. The street was empty, and behind her back, the vendor closed the door from the inside, obviously preparing to clean up and go home. But what am I going to do with you, silly? Emily asked sadly. As the puppy greedily devoured the food, she followed him all the way home, soaking wet from the rain. Skinny, panicked just like her, unwanted and alone like herself. She walked into the entryway and called the elevator. At the 10th floor, it descended, not lingering anywhere, and she was irresistibly drawn back. Finally, she couldn't stand it, waved her hand, and stepped outside. The puppy crouched against the wall, trying to hide from the rain. At the sight of Emily, he stood up and his tail wiggled hesitantly. Okay, let's go, just be quiet. She took him under her arm after all and headed into the apartment. Luckily, the hallway was empty and no one was cooking in the kitchen. She walked to her room, opened the door, left her shopping, and carried the puppy into the bathroom to hastily wash and feed him. Then she went back to her room and closed up. Surprisingly, he didn't run, barked, ate yesterday's porridge mixed with food, and fell sound asleep on the mat by the bed. Then, able to think of what to do with him next, Emily washed her face and fell asleep. Over time, as the baby grew older and she accustomed him to taking morning and evening walks, Emily grew accustomed to her new life. More than once, she thought that the decision to have a dog in a communal apartment was the height of insanity. However, fate favored them. In the meantime, a noisy man who liked to scandalize moved out of the next room. So they were left with Emily, a quiet, inconspicuous student who came only to sleep, and an equally quiet woman whom they met occasionally in the kitchen or on the stairs. None of them had made any complaints about the puppy. So she settled in. What was really hard to do was to keep hiding the pregnancy from her co-workers. She didn't want to be pitied or ask unnecessary questions that she herself would have had trouble answering. But it was impossible to avoid the topic forever either. "Emily, confess, are you expecting a baby?" Dana, the blonde waitress, once asked, nodding toward her already rounded tummy. "Yes, I'm expecting," Emily replied simply. Wow. The girl's eyebrows crept upward in surprise. She looked at her coworker with big eyes, but then added with a smile, "I'm happy for you." That evening, when they had already left, Dana gathered everyone in the locker room and broke. Everyone, except the receptionist, treated the new girl well. So they didn't mind congratulating her, and in a couple of days, a folding crib was purchased in the closet, and in the refrigerator food for a feast was saved. There was nothing to do. "Congratulate her on being pregnant," Jason said arrogantly, in response to the offer to join the group. Without him, however, there were plenty of people willing to join. Everyone from the cooks and waiters to the janitor and the janitorial staff joined in the festivity. Emily was moved to tears. She had not expected such a warm attitude on the part of total strangers and new people. And their gift came just in time, especially since they delivered and assembled it themselves. Now in the corner of Emily's room stood a pretty wooden crib with a blue mattress and pillows, and above it rock stars made of soft felt. And after the feast, for the first time in years, she was able to speak out and put into words all her pain, fears, and hopes. "I'm sorry if I'm minding my own business," Dana began when they were left alone to clean up the table. It was immediately clear what she wanted to ask: who's the father of the baby? After a moment's silence, Emily decided to speak. Her colleague was not the kind of person who spread gossip and asked only for the sake of idle curiosity. But still, telling about her personal life was very hard. "You don't have to tell me if you want to," Dana remarked, sensing the awkward pause. "He came to visit us in the village, to our relatives, businesslike, so handsome, in a car. We ran into him one day outside the store. We got to talking. He walked me almost home. 'Where in the middle of nowhere did you find such a beautiful girl?' I asked, and I blossomed. I thought I was in love. I thought I was, but I didn't. I wasn't actually in love. Only he wasn't what I thought he was. But that's something you don't realize right away." "So how did you end up here?" Dana asked. "He snuck me out and took me to the city," said Emily. "Really?" But seeing the horror in Dana's eyes, she smiled, like snatched me, sedated me with sleeping pills, and drove me away in a car. "No, I went on my own, and even happily at the time. I lived with my aunt." She worked on her relative's farm as a child. When her aunt found out that Emily had been sneaking out on dates, she pressed her, rebuked her, saying she was ungrateful and should pray to her for sheltering an orphan after her parents died. Dana blurted out in her heart. Emily cried but agreed with her. She was forced to work longer hours than usual, forced to spend her evenings in the vegetable garden, as if her hopes were dashed for something good. Cut off. He had to leave that day, and she shed so many tears that she could have watered all the beds with them. "But he didn't leave without you." No, she didn't notice anything from her grief. And he stood behind the fence and called to her softly. "You want to hurry?" he said. She nodded. Her heart was pounding like crazy, as if ready to jump out of her chest. How had her aunt not noticed? She still wondered, but he helped her over the fence, and the car was parked nearby. That's how she found herself in a house dress and dirty slippers in the city. What happened next? Dana asked impatiently. He rented an apartment. I lived in it for a while, bought me some clothes, and showed me around the city. It went on like that for a month and a half until I found out he was married. There was a lump in my throat, but I didn't want to cry. Apparently, the pain from those events gradually faded into the past. He said we either live like this or we split up. It turns out that it was just a hobby for him, a way to take a break from his wife and children. That's how I ended up on the street. I couldn't go back to my aunt. She'd eat me by train. I started to survive on temporary earnings, traveling around the cities in search of housing and food. And then I got pregnant like a snowball. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but no, my belly's growing. I haven't even been to the hospital once. How? Exclaimed Dana. Make sure you go. You have to get attached and get checked out. And histories, of course. You're good for coming to us. Luck. She smiled. Days went by. It turned out that even David's constant taunts and displeasure were something to get used to. It was getting harder and harder to do the dishes, get to and from work, and walk the baby. But even here, she tried not to complain and to look at everything with a positive attitude. One day, on her way home from her morning shift, Emily hesitated at the exit and sat down at a vacant table to tie her shoelaces. Her thoughts of how hard it would be to manage even simple tasks were suddenly interrupted. Behind her, at a neighboring table, sat a man and a woman. Apparently, they had come in for lunch and were animatedly discussing things at work. I went out into the hallway today, and he's standing in the window watching. Susan told me later that he stands like that every day. Waiting for his mom to come get him, came a pleasant female voice. Doesn't he have any relatives at all? The interlocutor asked. No one, as far as I know, refused Nick. And there's nothing to treat him for. What don't they treat him? They help, of course, as much as they can, and the doctor comes every week from the children's polyclinic. But you understand there's always not enough money. She could not tear herself away from the chair. A conversation between two strangers and even overheard. But the story they were discussing touched her to the core. When the guests got up, she got up as well and headed after them. Just going for a walk. For interest's sake, she promised herself. The man-woman didn't notice the surveillance. They continued to discuss something until they reached a gray, unassuming building surrounded by a metal fence. A playground was visible away from the entrance. The windows on the second floor were decorated with paper flowers. What's the surprise? This was an orphanage. The small figure of a blonde-haired boy wearing a blue plaid shirt appeared in one of the windows. He looked around, as if searching for someone with his eyes. When he spotted Emily, he rose on his tiptoes and looked at her expectantly. A moment later, the curtain behind which he had been hiding moved, and a large woman in a brightly colored blouse and a carelessly curled lock of hair appeared behind him. She took him by the arm and with difficulty led him away. The boy tried to hold on and grab the windowsill. The child's strength was not enough to resist. His heart plummeted downward. The conversation of the visitors, the scene in the window, the shelter it, all came together in one picture. She rang the intercom, told the guard she was here to see the director, and, finding the right office, knocked. Did I understand you correctly? You want to pay for Peter's treatment? The headmistress asked with restrained surprise. Yes, Emily replied confidently. On the way from the gate to this office, she had calculated that she would give away some of her modest savings. Well, good. We'll be glad to have you, said the superintendent. Tell me, are you a relative of his? No, I heard about his story by chance, said Emily. Can I see the boy? Peter stood at the window again, looking among the passers-by for someone to come and get him. He was too thin and small for a 5-year-old, and Emily wanted to hug him. Peter, you have visitors, his teacher told him calmly. The child turned around, eyes as blue as his shirt, and hesitantly peered out from behind the curtain. They were sitting in some office in the presence of the very woman from the orphanage who had dined at the restaurant that day. The boy folded his hands in his lap and fiddled with a small toy. Emily scolded herself for not carrying some cute little trinket in her bag, like a keychain or a notebook. What can I get you next time I'm here? She asked goodbye. It was obvious that Peter was glad that she had decided to come again, but he didn't dare to ask for anything, and only modestly lowered his head. Will you say something in my ear? Emily asked, leaning over, and he nodded in agreement. Hey, pencils, the boy whispered. Good, she said, and hugged him gently. That evening, counting the dollars she had saved, she took a deep breath, realizing how precious every dollar would soon be to her. Still, she didn't regret her decision to help Peter. She couldn't get past his story, especially after seeing it with her own eyes. The next day, Emily, completely immersed in her thoughts, did everything on automatic. Returning to the kitchen from the locker room, where she'd gone to get a sweater, she ran into a tall man who reminded her very much of Jason. At first, she'd mistaken him for her boss. "I'm sorry," she said guiltily, smiling. "That's all right," the stranger answered her. "Do you work here?" "Yes, in the kitchen." "My name is Emily. Nice to meet you." "I'm Kevin. Do you know where my brother Jason and your brother are?" "I think he went somewhere." "You better ask the manager," Emily suggested. He's in the lounge talking to the bartender." Kevin smiled sweetly, keeping his eyes on Emily, and went to look for David. The girl smiled back embarrassedly and then hurried into the kitchen. In a matter of weeks, the orphanage and its residents had become Emily's own. On weekends, she came to Peter's house, bringing fruit, toys, paints, felt tip pens, coloring books, and coloring books. Of course, all of this had to be shared with the other children. But in the moments when the two of them sat together in the meeting room, Peter became the sole owner of a whole wealth. Since their first meeting, the boy had grown cheerful and strong, and as before, he ran to the window where he now looked out for Emily. "I drew you a picture," he said one day, and handed her a sheet of paper. It showed a woman with long hair walking among the trees and flowers, holding the hand of a little boy in a blue shirt. In the corner was the inscription, "Emily from Peter." "Now, that's beautiful. Did you write the letters yourself?" Emily asked. "Yes," the boy answered proudly, fiddling with the design kit while Emily brushed away a tear. She'd never asked where he'd come from in the orphanage, whether he remembered his family, who he'd been waiting for looking out the window, but she wanted to know it very much. The girl went to the headmistress. "Oh, Emily, sighed the woman. "It would be all right if he were from some bad family." "What's wrong with his family?" Emily asked. "I didn't tell you that," she whispered. "He's the grandson of a local businessman. There's a restaurant not far from here. Have you seen it?" Emily nodded. "Well, they have these restaurants all over the city," continued the manageress. "And the boy here to us said." "How come?" Emily asked, dumbfounded. "I don't know," she said. "They say his eldest son and his wife divorced. She married a second time. Now he lives in luxury, and he forgot about the child. He sent gifts for a while, and then he disappeared. Peter remembers him. No, he was just a baby when he came to us, and if he's waiting for someone, we're all waiting." In the months she'd lived here, Emily had walked the entire neighborhood, so there was no doubt. There was only one restaurant in the neighborhood, and Peter was in her boss's family. The image of a wealthy, confident man of chic appearance, clearly in need of nothing, came to mind. How could he leave the child in the orphanage, forget about him, give him to the care of strangers? Her sense of injustice grew in her until it was impossible to contain it. "Dana, do you know where Timothy's father, our principal, is? Everyone talks about him with such respect," she asked as nonchalantly as possible, as if she were just curious. "I've only seen him once," Dana said. "A man like a man, short, gray-haired. He's kind of in charge of the main restaurant, and he's given his sons the branch." After finding the address of the place, Emily ran home after her shift to feed and take the baby outside. Then she drove downtown to meet Michael Alexander in person. He appeared to be a very personable and businesslike man, sitting in a leather chair behind a large, heavy desk. "What can I do for you?" he asked her courteously, looking at her carefully. "I don't know where to begin," Emily admitted and told him everything she knew, trying to be tactful and calm. Michael Alexander listened without interrupting. It was hard to tell from his face what he was thinking and how he felt about what he had heard. "So you're saying that I have a grandson?" Stretching his words after a pause, he said. "Yes," she answered confidently. "Well, good. Leave me your number. I want to know more about it. As soon as I know, I'll call you." And he called exactly 2 days later, saying that he did not know about his grandson, but now he wanted to participate in his fate. There was confusion and even sadness in his voice. "Did you really melt your grandfather's heart?" Jason asked, smiling, when Peter's story had become public. "I guess I did, didn't I?" Emily smiled back. "He wants to take him in, and he's asking me to babysit. I just don't know how I'm going to keep up with everything." "We'll leave you fewer shifts, and soon we'll send you on maternity leave," the boss said, and she thought he sounded tender in his voice and looked at her in a special way. "Emily, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Me?" Footsteps sounded behind her. It was Kyle. He was as surprised to see Peter as his father had been. But contrary to his anxious expectations, he didn't get angry or pull away. On the contrary, he also decided to take part in the boy's upbringing. "Emily, you're a very kind and bright person," the man said when they were alone. "Do not think that I left my wife and son. I really didn't know about him, but it's not for me to judge," he shrugged. They were nearing the end of their 5th month of pregnancy, but they were still strong enough to go about their daily business. Peter finally waited for his happiness and looked out the window. He was taken to his grandfather's house, given a whole room, and bought a sea of toys. In the mornings, he was taken to daycare by Michael Alexander's driver, and in the afternoons, Emily came over to study and play with him. The wife of the owner was about 20 years younger than him and was more engaged in her own life, so that she was almost not visible. The baby, unexpectedly for the owners, became the favorite of the whole apartment. Neighbors, and even the dog, who at first cold to the newcomer dog, with time became sociable with him. Freedom walked along the corridor and even sometimes stayed at someone's house for the night. Emily was glad. When it was time to give birth, she would have someone to leave him with. One warm day in August, when nothing seemed to be going wrong and work at the restaurant was going on as usual, the man Kyle had been talking to Sandy with suddenly changed his face. "But come by the manager's office when you're free," he said sternly as he looked into the kitchen. Everyone who was around at that moment looked at them in surprise. "I thought he was in love with you." "Oh, don't make up nonsense," Emily retorted, pretending it was no big deal, though she wondered how she could have earned that attitude. "How had he asked?" She'd walked into Jason's office after work, who'd left that day, leaving his older brother in his place instead of David, his deputy. "Why are you prying into someone else's life without figuring things out?" Kyle began his interrogation abruptly. "Is something wrong?" "I don't understand. That's what I don't understand. Why meddle in another family's affairs? I have to justify myself to my father for the umpteenth time. And it's all because of you, because you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." He'd never allowed himself to talk to her like that before, and she cried with resentment, holding herself back. It turned out that Kyle had called his ex-wife Sandy last night to remind her of her son. She had reacted coldly, not wanting to hear about her past life. The woman was quite happy with the way her fate had settled after the divorce. "You say you don't want a son?" Kyle asked her, starting to boil over. "And you're up for being a good father. I'll give you a look at you, Sandy. You're a fool, maybe you are. At least I'm not abandoning my child," I'm sure she was almost laughing. "What do you mean? Have you forgotten that we've been living like strangers lately? Have you lost your memory? It is not your child, not yours, as it is not mine." "Whose is it then? It doesn't matter. And anyway, I'm sick of you. Leave me alone. Why didn't I just block your number?" Sandy was indignant, while Kyle's unpleasant realization dawned on her. David. Yes, silence followed those words, and everything suddenly made sense. Silence. Nothing to say. So live with that for the rest of your life, knowing that your sick child is in an orphanage and your lover works under your ex-husband's boss. "Kyle, don't shame me. He promised to divorce his wife and take care of me and the boy." Sandy's voice shook, but he didn't wait for her remorse and disconnected. David, the restaurant administrator, was scandalously fired. He didn't want to lose his position over some personal relationship. "Get out," Kyle pointed at the door, and the usually cheerful face of the administrator twisted with anger. "Aren't you the boss here?" he said sharply and looked at Jason with hope in his eyes. "I stand in solidarity with my brother," the principal replied tiredly. "If you have thoughts of going to your father, you can waste no time. Will you? I'm sure he's furious that he had to recognize a complete stranger's child as his grandson." After all of this wrangling, Jason went home to not see his brother or anyone at all for a while. When he heard what had happened, he couldn't believe it. Even in the morning, it had seemed like things couldn't have turned out better. She had a place to live, a job, and a very attractive and wealthy man who was paying attention to her. Peter had finally found a family, and the only thing she had to think about was how to get healthy and have a son. "Should I leave now?" she asked without raising her eyes to Kyle. Yes, still in accounting, he cut him off stiffly. After getting the money, she headed over to Peter's house to play with him and take her mind off her heavy thoughts at the same time. Karina, Kyle, and Jason's stepmother opened the door. Seemed more like their sister. "What do you want?" she asked, looking Emily over from head to toe. "I came to study with Peter. Don't come here again." Michael Alexander said not to let you in. She slammed the door right in her guest's face. For a couple minutes, Emily stood like that, looking through the brown metal doors with gold embellishments in the shape of battered plants. This was it. Life was falling apart again. After the happy months with their plans and dreams, there was once again a bleak emptiness, uncertainty, and loneliness to look for a job again, but that would hardly be easy with a belly like this. And what about Peter? What would they say to him? How will they treat him now? All week, on her way to the store to look for a part-time job, Emily would purposely pass by the orphanage. Maybe she'd see Peter in the window, but there were other little faces peering out from behind the curtains, probably waiting for someone to come for them. There wasn't, but that didn't mean he was all right. She took a walk with the baby over the weekend and had a hurried snack. Emily lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time, wondering what to do next. The baby was moving slightly inside, and it immediately gave her strength and desire to live, because she was carrying a whole person and could not give up like that. In the corner of the room was a crib, which was gradually filled with tiny things. Instead of a stroller, she bought a sling to carry the baby to the hospital or the store. Not always convenient, but there wasn't enough money for a stroller anyway. There was a knock on the door. She shuddered in surprise, clumsily got up and opened it. "There's a man here to see you," the neighbor said, and went straight to his room. Who could it be? Wasn't David out to avenge his dismissal? Who knows? Emily walked cautiously to the door and looked through the peephole. Jason was standing there. "Hi," he said guiltily when he saw his former subordinate. "Hi." Emily looked at him questioningly, trying to figure out why he was here and if it had anything to do with Peter. "I'm sorry you had to get hurt because of our family squabbles. It's nothing really," he said. Taking the baby with them, they walked outside, leaving the gray yards and heading for the park. Jason took the leash, bought them each a large ice cream cone, and generally acted very attentive and caring. Emily was relieved. It felt so peaceful and good inside all of a sudden. "Do you know how Peter is?" she asked anxiously. "I don't know. I haven't been there in a long time, but I know he's staying at his father's house." While they were walking, Peter was running around the house, fleeing from his foster grandmother. He accidentally broke her favorite vase, and the woman was beyond angry. That's not to say she was really upset about the broken dishes. Rather, she was looking for an excuse to scare him, as she hated her grandson for taking attention away from her. Her husband had become too attached to the boy. The nursery was piled to the ceiling with toys. There were at least 3 scooters and a bicycle in the hallway. On weekends in the house appeared animators in costumes of cartoon characters. And in the evenings, the grandfather liked to sit with his grandson and chat about adventures, read him fairy tales. Such a distraction from her specialty could not help but anger that was not why she had married and pretended to be a model wife, to share the pedestal of the heiress with some child. True, the news that Peter became a bully cooled the ardor of Michael Alexander, and he began to come into the nursery less and less often. But that wasn't enough for Karina. She wanted the boy to go back to the orphanage and not spoil her plans. "Are you sad about work?" Jason asked, stroking the boy's head. "No, I'm not." They sat down on the bench. "Don't worry about it, and don't think about money at all." At one point, she would have been over the moon to hear such words. But too many things were weighing on her, so it was impossible to imagine how to get out of it. "Even if you help, I'm worried about Peter. I've gone to their place several times, but they either didn't open the door for me or Karina put me out with curses and promises to call the police on us. And Peter probably thinks I betrayed him," Emily said with a sigh. "Come on, she's not that scary," Jason smiled. "If you want, I can go over there one of these days, see how things are going, and give Peter something from you." "Oh, that would be great. Go, please," Emily asked, and he nodded in agreement. "But that's not all I'm worried about," she continued. "What else?" Jason asked anxiously, looking at Emily. It suddenly dawned on her that he wasn't just here out of politeness or guilt about being fired. "I have health problems. I haven't had a checkup in a long time. I had to survive, find a job, stay in hotels. I didn't have time for that. And recently they said that I need urgent treatment so that the baby will not be harmed, and I will be able to give birth safely. And what do you need for that?" "It's just a question of money." Jason was frightened. Emily sighed. She wanted to tell him that she had only enough money to pay for 2 months' rent and groceries, not to mention medicine and vitamins. But she couldn't. Don't ask for anything. You'll manage somehow, she said to herself and added aloud that she was the one complaining. Don't listen to her. Everything will be all right. Jason hugged her. Nothing in return for the endless fear and helplessness came a sense of calm and even a sense of happiness. He arrived at the communal apartment again that evening, this time with 2 bags of groceries. Jason looked pleased, as if he'd accomplished something very good, or he'd had a brilliant idea that he couldn't share yet. This is for you, he said cheerfully. Thank you so much, Emily brightened. Did something happen? I won't tell you before I tell you, but I promise you'll like it. With that, he left, and Emily greedily went through the goodies he'd brought her. She'd been saving money lately, buying only what she needed. And here were a variety of fruits, nuts, sweets, and yogurt. And among the variety of goodies, she found an envelope with the inscription, "No refusals are accepted for medicines. We need you healthy." Emily pressed the envelope to her chest, stroking her belly. Her baby was safe. Emily would be treated, and all should be well. It seemed to be the happiest moment she'd had in a while. Jason hadn't told her his plan until the last minute, apparently afraid she'd say no. So she didn't know where he was taking her until they pulled up to Michael Alexander's house. "We're going to Peter's," she asked cautiously. "Yes, but first to my father's." "Say, would you like to take Peter in with you if you have a place to live?" "I'm not arguing, just say yes or no." "Of course I would," Emily said. She wanted to adopt Peter, but she didn't want to live off Jason. And that was exactly what he was thinking, judging by his questions. There was no way out. Overcome with self-doubt, she followed him straight to Michael Alexander's office. They came to the end of the chicly laid-back hallway, the door ajar, and a blonde head peeked out. Emily waved at Peter, and he smiled back. "We'll be in to see you soon," she said. The restaurateur was half reclining in a large armchair with a book in his hands, clearly surprised to see the uninvited guests. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked in his usual polite manner. "Hi, Daddy. We need to talk," Jason said simply. "All right, I'm listening." Michael Alexander sounded displeased. He certainly didn't want to have any conversation. "We want to raise Peter on our own. You don't want him, do you?" The man grinned, lifted himself up, and threw his finger to the side. "Oh, how? Do you want—" "Yes, we sure do," Jason answered, looking into his father's eyes. Emily's heart warmed at those words. So her youngest son had grown up. "All right then, you can raise him if you want to live. Where will you be?" Michael Alexander thought, returning to his semi-reclined position and folding his hands on his stomach. "Not here, I hope," Jason said. "I'm getting ready to leave." "Then we're taking him." Peter stood tall and stepped out from behind the door, afraid he'd miss the moment when the guests left. He had decided for himself that he would check out, grab onto Emily, and never let go, because he couldn't sit alone and put up with Karen's nagging anymore, and his grandfather had almost stopped paying attention to him. "Emily, I've missed you so much," he said, hugging her as hard as he could, and then he hurried on. "Please don't leave me here. Please, please don't. I don't want to stay here anymore." "Of course I won't, Peter. Come on, pack your things and let's go. And there's a surprise waiting for you at home." The boy's eyes lit up at those words. He ran into his room and began clumsily putting his clothes into his backpack. He and Jason helped him gather the essentials and find his favorite toys. As they left the house, the company spotted Karen by her bright red, shiny car in the yard. She looked at them with disdain and smiled contentedly, realizing that the baby was no longer in her house. Peter hid behind Emily's back. As they walked past, no one noticed that Michael Alexander was watching them at that moment from the office window. He sighed and watched the car drive away until it disappeared around the corner. That evening, the surprise was not only for the boy who had long dreamed of a dog. Emily stood for a long time in the hallway of the apartment Jason had brought them to. That was the position he'd caught her in when he lifted her things out of the trunk. "What are you doing? Come on in," he said, smiling, and set the bags on the floor. From the living room came a cheerful murmur. Peter and the baby were already settling into their new accommodations and rolling around on the floor in their arms, one snickering, the other wincing. "I don't believe it," Emily muttered quietly. "Don't believe me." "Why not?" Jason got upset. "I don't," she smiled back. "I don't believe it happens like this, and that we're going to live in an apartment like this." Scared you. It's a fun apartment, like an apartment. It'll do for the first time. But for the future, of course, we need a larger one." He helped them clean up and put things away, and then he left, leaving them to settle in. In a day of joyful upheaval, Peter fell asleep immediately, and with him the baby, poking his wet red nose into the blanket. He was sleeping peacefully, not the other way around. For a long time she couldn't settle down to lie down. The days she had spent in her room with fear, contemplating the future, were imprinted in her with perpetual worry and dread. Thus, the birth of their son seemed to be an unpredictable and terrifying event, and their further existence in a small apartment with a shared bathroom and kitchen, a constant domestic discomfort. Now she wandered quietly through the stylishly furnished living room, looked into the kitchen, admired the snow-white bathroom with a large mirror and a warm floor. She looked out the window at the lights of the city at night. It was more like a dream than reality. For the first time, it seemed, in her entire life, she felt completely safe. Sleep caught up with her toward morning. Jason had paid for 3 months' rent at once. He'd helped set up the crib, brought gifts, and just visited often. At first, Emily had been haunted by the feeling that there was some intent or deception behind it all. Then came a sense of obligation to Jason. But thanks to a sincerity and kindness toward them, all of that soon passed, and she was just glad for the idol. What do the doctors say? He inquired on one of his visits. All is well, they say. In November I will give birth. Son is healthy, developing perfectly, and weight is normal, said Emily. And she thought involuntarily what a good dad Jason would be. Somewhere in the back of her mind was the hope that he would love her baby and Peter as if they were his own. Oh, and guess what? While I was driving to the women's health clinic, I met Peter and his babysitter from the orphanage. What does she say? He asked politely. I didn't think it was a good idea to tell him about it after all. Oh, nothing. Glad Peter's living well now. Not that everyone there remembers him, because no one but him spent so much time at the window waiting. At that moment, a toddler in star-spangled pajamas and a scarf around his neck came running into the kitchen. And Peter, with an equally cheerful hairdo and a smeared face, ran in following. Mom, you know how he runs fast like an athlete, the boy said, panting. And, apparently coming to his senses, looked with big eyes at Emily, and then at Jason, said, what exactly? Great. Maybe we'll put him in the runner sports section. Emily smiled. She reached over, hugged him, and whispered in his ear, I love you, son. Peter brightened, took the candy from the table, and ran back into the living room, but immediately returned and cheerfully declared, I always knew it. In the light of events, the babysitter story was forgotten and no longer remembered as completely insignificant. Jason and Emily spent the rest of the evening quietly discussing the changes that had taken place in Peter's life over the past month. How he'd grown, how he'd stopped startling at night, how he'd taken responsibility for walking his favorite dog, and now these new, unfamiliar feelings, warm, joyful, overwhelming. But as soon as Jason left and all the chores were done, the thoughts returned. The babysitter they'd accidentally bumped into when they decided to walk from the hospital to the house. It had been creepy. She was such a chatterbox and would talk nonstop about everything that was going on in and out of the orphanage. We love Peter dearly, of course. It's so good that you took him in and that everything worked out for him. He is a wonderful boy, kind, responsive, whatever you ask always does. He just stands by the window. I feel sorry for him. I know he's waiting for his mom and dad, but I can't help him. The woman approached the territory, waving her grocery bags amusingly. Thank you for loving the children so much. Emily smiled. Who's your second child? A boy or a girl? Not jealous? No, I think we have enough love and attention for all of them, answered the nanny. That's good. And then there are all sorts of people. First they leave and then they come back, and the child has waited so long for her. Have you heard something? That someone had come to Peter's house before? Emily was surprised, but she thought she'd misunderstood. No, the woman mumbled. But I'm not going to keep quiet, so I'll just say it as it is. A woman came here, asking about him again. At first, she said she was a distant relative. She came to see him. She was interested in who took the child, were they to a family or just transferred to another institution. Then we got to talking. I even had time to cry. What did she say? Why did she decide to find out about her son after all these years? The unexpected news knocked Emily off her feet. Was this woman really going to take the baby away? Why would she want him? Because, like Kyle said, she lived in luxury, and didn't need any children. "Well, who knows her?" the nanny said. "The man, I understand, let her down. A new wife, mother-in-law, did some nasty things. But don't worry, I didn't tell her anything. It's strictly forbidden." "Well, thank you for telling me about the wife. I don't remember the details. Like she was the one who convinced her to keep the baby in the hospital, and then she fought with my father's brother all the time, tried to break him up. In general, some unpleasant woman in their family." Sighed the nanny. "Oh, thank you very much again," Emily said quickly, deciding to go the other way. She needed to be alone with her thoughts. "You take good care of Peter and come visit sometime." "You're always welcome," Nanny said good-naturedly. "Of course we will," Emily promised as they walked through the yards, past houses, playgrounds, and parking lots. Emily was determined that she would call Michael Alexander and tell him what she had learned. It felt like something unkind was lurking in his young wife. At that moment, she had no idea how fatal her call would be, upsetting him and his sons, and leaving Peter, to whom he was attached as a grandson, the elderly businessman, would be all alone. Of course, he had a staff of assistants, a driver, a gardener, a cook, a maid, and Michael Alexander had a wife, young, beautiful, slender, and spectacular. But none of these people really needed him. Everyone was only after his monetary interest. He handed over all the business affairs to Karina, and himself spent most of his time at home, sitting in his incredible-sized chair, drinking his favorite coffee and reading books. These cases brought him pleasure, but could not replace the simple live communication. With trembling hands, she dialed the number she had secretly written down from David's notebook long ago. "Hello," came the harsh male voice. "Michael Alexander, hello, it's Emily. You probably don't even want to hear from me, but there's something I really need to tell you." "It's important," she said quickly, in one breath so as not to slip up. She was surprised when, instead of hanging up or saying mean things, the man seemed pleased. "Hi, Emily, go ahead," he said in a measured tone. "One man was very persuasive about leaving the baby in the hospital, and he also tried to quarrel you and your sons and them among themselves. This person is your wife, Karina. I don't know how to explain it to you, but I think she's dangerous to you. Please be careful. Take care of yourself." "Understood," Michael Alexander said after almost a minute's silence. "Thank you. Tell Jason and Peter not to take offense at me." "Okay, I will." What happened next? She didn't know. Whether he listened to what she said, or whether he took it as silly fiction, or whether he told Karina about it. And they laughed together. Whatever it was, she did what she had to do. Let them deal with it themselves. She didn't dare say anything more. Emily was afraid of Jason's reaction. He hadn't liked to talk about his family since he'd been fired, and he didn't want to talk to his relatives. The news came on a most unexpected day. Since morning, she did not pull up her stomach, lying in the bathtub, but the contractions did not let go. On the contrary, little by little they intensified, although so far they were absolutely tolerable. Deciding to herself that there was enough money for the trip, she did not call the doctor and began to pack a bag to the maternity hospital. At that very moment, Jason knocked on the door, excited and pleased. "You're not going to believe this," he announced loudly, taking off his jacket. "My dad just called me. He was surprised. Yeah, he invited us over for a peace offering." "What about his Karina? She doesn't like guests." "But there is no Karina anymore," he added with a laugh. "Where did she go?" Emily, too, was amused by how funny Jason could be. But then a grimace of pain crossed her face, and the smile on his face changed to one of alarm. "What's wrong? Does it hurt?" He was frightened. "I'm going to the hospital." "It's time," Emily said in a snap and pointed to the clear bag on the bed. "So what's up with Karina, huh?" "Well, screw Karina. How are you going to do it? Right now? What am I supposed to do?" "Don't worry," she smiled. "I'll pack now and we'll go quietly. Just pick Peter up from daycare tonight, please, and tell him we'll be back soon with his brother." Jason was a little calmer now, but he still looked at her anxiously. And there was no doubt about Peter. He was in good hands for distractions on the road. Emily did ask to tell the interesting story of Karina's disappearance, though. It turned out that after that call, Michael Alexander really became suspicious, hired a private investigator, installed hidden cameras in the house, which he viewed in real time. That kind of vigilance proved to be very useful. His wife was going to poison her elderly husband and present everything as an accident. Mixed up, they say, the medicine drank what was needed. His heart couldn't take it. Dobre, Karen waved away, when her husband showed her a video where she slips a pill into the coffee. What's crazy? Michael Alexander laughed, surprised at her insolence. It's your medicine. The doctor prescribed it. I forgot. He already prescribed drops, not pills, he continued, forcing her to justify herself. They weren't on the prescription. I bought the pills. If you don't want them, don't take them. I care about you, and you're suspicious. Show me the pills. Leave me alone. You senile old man. She screamed hysterically and ran to the kitchen to hide the medicine, but her husband beat her to it. How can you be so cruel? Emily shook her head indignantly. What did her father do? He kicked her out as usual and threatened to go to the police if she tried to hurt him or us again. Although I think we should have filed a report. This is a real assassination attempt. Emily was met in the waiting room and asked to go to the ward. As they parted, they hugged, and Jason whispered in her ear, "It's going to be okay. I love you." It was amazing how much those words affected her. It felt so warm and safe at once. The boy was born late that night, and Jason and Peter were with them in the morning. They were admiring the red face and the white bonnet. The baby opened one eye and looked at him seriously and smacked his lips softly. "Will he always be so small?" Peter asked in a whisper. "No, he will grow up quickly, learn to run, and you will play together in the cars." "You," said his mother. "I don't know what to do with such a little one," the boy exhaled. "Really?" Jason and Emily exchanged understanding looks. After they were discharged, Mikey's grandfather and uncle wanted to meet the newborn. Emily only smiled as she watched a broad-shouldered and sad Michael Alexander gently rock the baby while Kyle gave him advice on what lullaby to sing to help the baby sleep better. The family is finally reunited. A year and a half after these events, Emily began to leave her youngest son with a nanny and herself returned to the restaurant where she was now in charge of things in the kitchen. The guests loved the menu, which was updated with her participation, so there was plenty of work to do. One thing had been troubling her heart all this time, but Jason was so preoccupied with work and the children that he kept putting off a decision that was important to both of them. Finally, one day, arriving at the restaurant, as usual by 9, Emily discovered a sign at the entrance that read "Special Service." "What is that?" She wondered and walked inside to the lounge exit. A path of pink petals. Trying not to step on them, Emily stepped forward, planning to reprimand the new receptionist for not telling her in advance about the festivities, what the menu would be, how many people would be there, and what time they would be arriving. Were the thoughts in her head getting confused? Maybe that was why she didn't immediately realize what was going on. The hall was decorated with fresh flowers and ribbons, and in the center stood a large cake with champagne and glasses. All the restaurant staff were crowded around it, and Michael Alexander was here, and behind them was someone else. Jason, Emily said more out of surprise than any desire to address her lover. He came out to her satisfied, happy in a suit, and with a bouquet in his hands. Only now did she remember yesterday's hints, dressing up and the suspicious need to leave early this morning. "Oh, good thing I wore a dress," Emily thought, feeling her legs and arms begin to tremble with excitement. "My sweet Emily." Jason began very formally. "We've been together for so long, but I kept putting this event off. The household, the moves, the kids. Everything seemed like the wrong time, but now I'm ready." He pulled a box out of his pocket and opened it. Inside glittered a gold ring set with many small shining diamonds. "Marry me," he smiled, and Emily glowed back, nodding, "Of course," and all the guests applauded. The next event swirled before her like a kaleidoscope. The flowers, the white dress, Peter in his first business suit, Jason's delighted face when she walked out to him, and they got into a white car decorated with gold rings. Music, clinking glasses, the glitter of flares. Guests twirled in a dance, winking, smiling at the newlyweds, who also kept up and set the tone for the entire evening. In the midst of all this splendor, she was transported back for a moment, and a long fenced-in area, a rosary in Zoe's face. Her past appeared before her. At that moment, the closest thing to it. The first date, the elopement, the trains, the markets. Surprisingly, she'd almost forgotten that time, even though it had seemed like it was with her forever at the time. What would have happened if she hadn't decided to climb over the fence, get into the car, and drive off into the unknown with her hands dirty after work, without belongings and without money? It's scary to imagine, and how great everything turned out in the end after so many years of hardships, trials, and worries. Suddenly, the frightening images of childhood and youth blurred. Music, voices, and joyful laughter around her came back again. The smiling faces of her friends spun around. Yes, now she is where she feels good. The people she loves the most, Emily, her mom and her wife, are around. And there are still a lot of pleasant troubles ahead. Family joys, children's laughter, small gifts for holidays, joint trips to the movies, and much more. Now everything will definitely be very good. Andrew opened a cold can of beer, lounged on the bench, and took a sip. Life is good. He only had to go to work tomorrow. He worked as a picker in a huge hypermarket 2 days later, 12 hours a shift. The work was not easy, but he managed it and even regularly received bonuses for exceeding the plan. He completed bags for couriers of the delivery department and separately for the magician Zoe. What was distinctive about Andrew was his weakness for the female sex. He does not become attached to anyone for a long time. He changed women like gloves. Less than 6 months had passed since he had taken over the entire female staff of the hypermarket, and there were rumors that he had even encroached on the Holy of Holies, the accounting department, for which he was beaten by the men. They said that even beating him was disgusting. That's how he would have skated from one woman to another, if not for Zoe. She worked as a cashier in the department. Her eyes were like 2 deep lakes. Her voice was like the trumpet of Jericho. And she always smiled when Andrew passed her cash register. He noticed how she caught his eye, and this gave him courage. Andrew decided that Zoe was the one he wanted to keep close. One day, when Andrew was standing in line at Zoe's to buy groceries for dinner, he decided to talk to her. "Hello, beauty," he said, smiling. Zoe turned very slowly and sedately and looked at him like a boa constrictor at a rabbit. "Hello, if you're not joking," she answered quietly. Zoe, with her powerful personality and indomitable energy, was a true Amazon. Everyone in the area knew her and was afraid of her. Men and women walked around her. Even the dogs on the street crawled away when she passed by. Andrew first met Zoe on that significant day when she was dispersing a group of hooligans who were trying to rob an old woman from the magician Zoe. She ran up to them like a thunderstorm and began waving her arms like a big windmill. The hooligans scattered like cockroaches, and Zoe helped the old lady get up and took her to the store. "Thank you, daughter. You are a real heroine," said the old lady, hugging Zoe. Zoe smiled and turned away. "You're welcome," she muttered. "I just don't like it when the weak are offended." Andrew was amazed. He saw how Zoe dealt with bullies, how she decisively entered into conflicts with the enemy. She was not just a beautiful woman with deep eyes. She was strong as thunder, and her presence filled everything around her. He decided to meet her. "Hello," Andrew said, approaching Zoe. "You are a real fighter. How do you do it?" Zoe smiled. "I'm just not afraid of anyone since childhood," she answered. "And I don't allow others to be afraid of me." Since then, they became friends. Andrew learned that Zoe is not only a threat to bullies, but also a caring daughter who takes care of her old mother. They spent evenings together, walked around the city, discussed their plans and dreams. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Zoe asked once. "No, I respect your strength and determination," Andrew replied. And so their story began. Andrew and Zoe, wind and thunder, merged into one big sky. They were inseparable, like lightning and thunder. Their friends and acquaintances looked at them with respect and a little fear, because Zoe was not just a woman. She was a woman who was feared by everyone who ever encountered her. That evening, when the city was shrouded in fog and the streets were empty, Zoe and Andrew were walking in the park, and they had long been more than friends, but less than lovers. Andrew always felt that Zoe was not just a woman, but a force of nature that he would like to always have by his side. "Andrew, have you ever thought about the future?" Zoe began, stopping at an old oak tree. Andrew looked at her, and his gaze was full of questions. "Of course I thought. And you know, there is always you in my future," he answered Zoe, smiling. Her eyes shone like 2 stars in the night sky. "I want you to be with me not only in the future, but also now," she said, taking his hands. "Andrew, I want you to become my husband." Andrew was amazed. He never thought this could happen. Zoe had always been a mystery to him, rebellious, free. But now she stood in front of him, offering him her hand and heart. "Are you serious?" he asked, not believing his ears. "Absolutely," Zoe answered, squeezing his hands tighter. "I don't want to be the woman everyone is afraid of. I want to be your wife, your support, your peace of mind." Andrew looked at her and realized that this moment was inevitable. Whether he wants it or not, he will become her husband, and then whatever happens. He realized that Zoe was not the worst thing that had happened to him in his life. "Zoe, I will be the happiest man in the world if you become my wife," he said. They walked through the park, ate ice cream, and then, like two school children, they went to the cinema and took tickets to the last row. Andrew tried to kiss Zoe when the lights went out, but he didn't dare. She was too monumental. The next day, while he was working, he went to get some groceries for lunch. And of course, he stood in line at the cash register where Zoe was working. She worked silently and decisively, like a large and precise machine gun. He even began to worry when his turn approached. "Hello. How did you sleep?" Andrew didn't know what to start talking about, although he usually had a good tongue. He knew how to handle women's ears. "Hello, if you're not joking," Zoe answered without a smile and began to punch through the goods. "I slept great, but the mosquitoes bothered me. It's okay. I'll buy plates. They fly away quickly." "Shall we meet at the weekend?" Andrew asked timidly. "Certainly. How can we live without it?" Zoe answered just as colorlessly. "Next, don't hold up the line. We'll talk later." Andrew was at a loss as to how to behave. On the one hand, she herself invited him to marry her, and on the other hand, she acted as if she didn't know him at all. Zoe and Andrew took one day off together and decided to spend the weekend at a recreation center by the lake. Andrew took his old SUV and Zoe packed a tent, sleeping bags and food. They set off, giggling and weaving their car along the road like two teenagers who stole their dad's car and just ran away from school. At the recreation center, they pitched a tent near the shore of the lake. Moreover, the tent pegs were installed by Zoe. She tied the tent to them. Andrew put down the sleeping bags. In the evening, the two of them sat by the fire, hugged, and looking at the stars. Andrew told Zoe about his adventures, and Zoe listened to him, smiling. At night, they could not sleep for a long time because mosquitoes were pestering them. Andrew wanted to pester Zoe, but she fell asleep with lightning speed and started snoring so that he had no chance. The next morning, they decided to go for a ride on the lake on an inflatable boat. "Andrew, this boat was inherited from my father. He often fished on it." Zoe was delighted with the idea, and the two of them got into the boat and set sail. Andrew realized that he needed inflatable vests and borrowed them from a neighbor. So they were both wearing orange life jackets. The lake was calm, there was no wind, and they swam, enjoying the silence and beauty of nature. Suddenly, Zoe felt that the boat began to sink. The water filled it, albeit quite slowly. Zoe panicked. Andrew immediately grabbed the oar and began to row quickly, steering the boat towards the shore. Zoe held on to the edges of the boat. Her eyes were full of horror. "Zoe, hold on, we'll get to the shore," Andrew shouted. Zoe was shaking, but she believed Andrew. He was her savior. Her, a woman who was not afraid of anything. When they finally reached the shore and climbed out of the boat, wet, Zoe hugged Andrew. "So scared," she said, as if she were a little girl and he was her dad or older brother. Andrew smiled and kissed her forehead, as if she really were his daughter. "Zoe, I will always be there. We are always together. Like wind and thunder, like lightning and rain." "A good fire wouldn't hurt us," said Zoe. She climbed into the tent and changed into a swimsuit and threw a towel over herself. Andrew was making a fire at this time so that he could warm up. Soon the flame was large enough, and Zoe hung a pot of water on the fire. She deftly peeled the potatoes and opened a can of stew. Soon they were enjoying a hot meal, and the dangerous incident faded into memory. The adventures at the recreation center continued. They walked through the forest, picked berries, and enjoyed nature. But one day, when they were walking along a narrow path, a brown bear came out from behind the trees. He was huge, fluffy, and hungry. Zoe stopped. Her eyes widened in horror. Andrew also noticed the bear and froze in place. The bear slowly approached, his eyes sparkling like coals in a fire. "Andrew, don't move. The bear is not aggressive if we don't touch it," Zoe whispered. Andrew nodded, but his heart was beating faster. The bear was too close. Zoe picked up the branch and began to slowly wave it in front of the bear. "Go away, bear, this is not your territory," she shouted. The bear hesitated. His eyes became smaller. She continued to swing the branch like a sword. "You shall not pass. This is our forest," she screamed. The bear retreated, its fur rose, but it did not attack. Zoe continued to squeal and threaten him with the branch until he disappeared into the forest. Andrew looked at Zoe with admiration. She was not just a woman, she was a real mistress of the forest. Her strength and determination were amazing. "You saved us from the bear," he said, hugging her. Zoe smiled and her eyes sparkled. She approached Andrew, kissed him, and dragged him into the tent. She was a passionate, loving woman and almost strangled her future husband. Andrew, barely able to stand, crawled out of the tent and walked towards the lake. There he washed himself, then began to wash himself and screamed loudly at the top of his lungs. Out of surprise, the birds flew off their nests and circled over the forest. "Andrew, let's get ready to go home. What if this bear decides to come back here at night when we are sleeping?" "What do you mean? Are you skin and bones? Here I am, food for him for several days," Andrew said, getting out of the tent. "I wanted to offer this to you myself." "Then let's get ready." And together they dismantled the tent and rolled it up, put all their things in the trunk, and finally decided to take a walk in the forest, which was full of berries. Zoe took the jar and was going to fill it with aromatic berries. Andrew was already tired of walking. But Zoe did not let up. She moved from bush to bush and resembled a bear herself. Andrew admired. He came up behind her and stroked her back. "I'm finishing now." Andrew looked at her with tenderness and suddenly froze in horror. A black viper was crawling not far from her leg, and he saw a lot of them as a child in the village with his grandmother, when he ran into the forest with a neighbor's boy to pick blueberries. Zoe didn't move. Andrew picked up the earth stick and quickly threw the snake away from Zoe. There was just a viper here. Only this was not enough. Then a bear. Then a viper. "We've already gone. We've gone," Zoe laughed so hard that her whole body shook. "That's it. Enough of this nature." "I suddenly wanted to go to the city," Andrew announced, and he got behind the wheel. "Come on, jump in." He shouldn't have said that, because when Zoe jumped, the car sank sharply and almost began to scrape the bottom on the ground. The SUV's engine roared, and in 2 leaps the car found itself on a country road that led from the forest to the mountains. Zoe got sick on the road and fell asleep, lounging in the back seat. And Andrew was wondering whether he should be happy or sad that he would have a wife like Zoe Ida. He imagined that they would have children, 2 girls like Zoe and 2 boys like him. He dreamed so much about the future sweet family idol that he almost missed the turn he needed. But he came to his senses in time. Zoe and Andrew did not have a wedding, she insisted. There was only an ordinary, non-celebratory painting, to which Zoe and Ida came in a champagne-colored dress, and it suited her very well. She poked a similar-colored rosebud into her head and turned out to be the prettiest bride that day. After painting, the 2 of them went to a country estate, which had a sauna and a swimming pool, as well as its own mini zoo. Well, and accordingly, a restaurant. Zoe's friend Luda worked in this restaurant. She set the table to the highest standard. There was black and red caviar, trout, stuffed breaded squid, and octopus tentacles. And in the center there was a dish with stuffed crab shells. Zoe agreed on this seafood menu in advance with Andrew. "You see, I really want to try this seafood. Let's order it for the wedding." "Of course, come on," Andrew agreed. Because arguing with Zoe meant condemning yourself to a slow, painful death. When they entered the restaurant, there were no visitors, only their table was set, on which candles were burning, and there was a composition of white and cream flowers. "Come in. Now we'll serve the dishes," said Luda. "Congratulations on your legal marriage. Finally, you have found your betrothed. Don't pay too much attention to him. You won't get it," Zoe said belligerently. "Come on. I have Vasya. He is my best man in the world." "This is good. Come on, work. You've paid for it," Zoe urged her friend angrily. "Don't be offended. I'll bring everything now." She brought out plates of food and separately cut lemons lengthwise on a saucer so that lemon juice could be sprinkled on the fish. Andrew tried everything and decided that regular potatoes with meat were much better. Zoe was also disappointed in the seafood, but what's done is done. and she decided not to spoil the evening with grumbling and nagging. "Let's go and dance. I hope the bear hasn't gotten here yet." Zoe dabbed her lips with a napkin, stood up from the table, and offered her hand to Andrew. They danced for a long time. Zoe had a good sense of rhythm and an ear for music. She quietly sang along with the singer, and this song did not at all fit with her appearance. It seemed like some thin girl was singing. Andrew was once again amazed at how much he didn't know about Zoe. He led her like a true captain of a ship in a storm, and she obediently followed his movements. After dinner, when the sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, Andrew and Zoe decided to take a walk around the estate. The air was so fresh that it seemed as if they were breathing in life itself. Zoe took Andrew's hand, and they headed towards a small pond surrounded by blooming roses. It was reflected in the water like a magic mirror and created a magical atmosphere. "You know, Andrew, I have always dreamed of a place where you can retire, enjoy nature, and just be yourself." Andrew smiled. They sat down on the bench, and Zoe laid her head on Andrew's shoulder. In the distance, the night sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves could be heard. At that moment, they were happy, like two heroes from a romantic story. "Andrew, do you believe in fate?" "To fate." Andrew thought about it. "Maybe. But I have more faith in our own decision. We create our own destiny." "You are right. And at this moment, I understand that my destiny is you." Andrew lifted her face and kissed her. Their lips met in a tender kiss, as if uniting two halves of one soul. Andrew and Zoe decided to take a walk around the estate, and suddenly Zoe noticed something strange. She walked up to an old tree that looked like it had been there for centuries. Andrew followed her. Curiosity sparkled in his eyes. "Look, Andrew. This is some kind of secret passage. Look, there's a small door here." Andrew looked closer, and indeed saw a small door hidden among the roots of a tree. It was covered in moss and looked as if no one had opened it for a long time. "Let's check," Andrew suggested, and the two of them opened the door. Behind her was a narrow staircase leading down. "Where does it lead, I wonder?" Zoe asked. "Let's find out," Andrew answered. He turned on the flashlight on his phone and they began to descend. The stairs were steep and dark, but they moved forward, despite the unknown. A few minutes later, they found themselves in an underground room. Light penetrated through narrow cracks in the ceiling, illuminating the ancient stone walls. In the center of the room, there was a table on which lay a dusty book. "What is this?" Zoe asked, picking up the book, from which clouds of dust rose. "Let's see," said Andrew, and they began to read. The book told about the mysterious history of the estate, about secret passages and treasures hidden in its depths. "I feel somehow uneasy." "Let's go back upstairs and not continue exploring," Zoe said, looking around. Suddenly they heard some knocking from above. Someone closed the door and nailed it with boards. The sound of a hammer was heard. "Wait, we're here." Andrew shouted and rushed up the stairs. The man, who was asked to board up the passage so that no one would poke his nose in there, was terribly frightened when inhuman screams were heard from underground. The acoustics in that room were such that every word spoken in the room was heard loudly on the surface. The carpenter threw the hammer and boards and ran in horror wherever his eyes looked. He did not have time to firmly lock the passage, and Andrew tried to knock down the door with his shoulder, but it did not give in. He went down and let Zoe pass ahead of him. She stood up and kicked the door open with one powerful blow. There was a breath of freshness and coolness coming from the street. "Let's go, let's take the book with us. We honor it." She took Andrew's hand and they walked back to the hotel for dinner. Zoe asked Luda to bring them regular fried potatoes and pork chops. Luda fulfilled the order, adding mushrooms and pickles. "This is what I understand dinner," said Andrew, and ate everything. "I am also more inclined to potatoes. We wanted seafood. We tried it, and it was fine." Zoe lived with her mother in a 3-room apartment. "My father lived for a long time with another family, in which he had a blood sister and brother. Since there was not enough money, Zoe went to work immediately after the 9th grade, and then completed her studies at night school. Zoe's mother worked as a school director, and Zoe was taught discipline from early childhood. She also taught her to cook and sew well, and also took her to a dance class. Zoe, on her own initiative, took up Sambo and achieved success. If she had not fallen in love with the coach when she saw him, the whole mood to train disappeared and her knees trembled. Naturally, Zoe was defeated by weaker opponents, although she was stronger than the entire team combined. It all ended with her being jealous of a girl from the team and pulling her rival's hair hard, for which she was expelled from the team. In parting, she slammed the door so loudly that a huge piece of plaster fell off the ceiling of the gym and fell on the coach's head. With a traumatic brain injury, he was taken to the hospital, from where he never returned to work, and was transferred to head a chess club near his home. Having suffered a little for the sake of order, Zoe decided that all this was nonsense, and she had to earn her living. And my mother had already retired, the amount of which left much to be desired. So she got a job as a cashier at a hypermarket. Training took place on the spot, and here students took exams and were immediately sent to the cash register. At first, Zoe was frightened by the crowd of people who stood at her cash register, and by various problems with the product, which periodically arose mainly due to the fault of the accounting department. The sellers were putting out items that had not yet been shown in the program, and because of this, Zoe had to yell across the room, "Kate, how much does cheese cost? It's not in the program. I'll take a look now. Come quickly. I have a kilometer-long queue." The day Zoe encountered the director of the hypermarket, she was already on the edge. The line stretched all the way to the door, and every customer was unhappy with the delay. When another product did not go through the system, Zoe could not stand it. "Kate, how much does this chicken cost? There is no such product in the system." "Just a second, Zoe. Everything will be now." Kate answered and went to the accounting department. But when Kate returned with the price, Zoe was already standing face to face with the director of the hypermarket, who came out to see what was going on and why they were shouting. "I can't work in such conditions," Zoe blurted out in anger. The director tried to hush up the problem, talked about difficulties, but Zoe is not one to remain silent. "Listen, if you cannot ensure the normal functioning of the Zoe magician, then maybe it's time to give way to someone more competent." The director turned red with anger, but Zoe's words resonated with the customers, who began to applaud. Zoe, feeling supported, continued, "I'm not here to correct your mistakes. I am here to serve people who, after a hard day at work, come to the store to buy food and are forced to stand in line because some chicken in the accounting department is sleeping on the keyboard instead of quickly processing the goods." The director, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, quickly left, promising to resolve all the problems. Zoe, nodding with satisfaction to the customers, continued her work, knowing that today she had done something important not only for herself but for everyone in this hypermarket. Zoe continued her work at the hypermarket, but her life was limited only to the cash register and price tags. After all, Zoe was not just a cashier but a real woman, capable of making changes in the most unexpected situations. One day, when Zoe was again standing at her cash register, she noticed that Director Richard was again trying to evade responsibility. He worked around the problems, and Zoe decided it was time to learn the order and discipline that her mother taught her. "Richard, we are having supply problems again. Products do not match price tags. Buyers are slowly starting to rebel." "Zoe, I'm busy. I have an important meeting." "Will you figure it out yourself?" Richard asked. "Of course, Richard, I always figure it out. But here's what I suggest. Let's switch places. You will stand at the cash register, and I will go solve problems with the goods." Richard, not expecting such an offer, agreed. Zoe took his keys and headed towards the office. There she discovered that the accounting department had again screwed up the prices and the products were incorrectly placed on the shelves. Zoe set to work decisively. A few hours later, she returned to Richard, who was already standing at the cash register, trying to deal with dissatisfied customers. "Richard, I have everything sorted out. Now, do you know what it's like to establish order and discipline?" Richard was amazed. Zoe not only solved the problem with price tags, but also showed him that the director should be aware of all processes in the Zoe store and be more responsible. Since then, Zoe has become not only the best employee for the accounting department, but also for Richard. Sometimes she even joked that she would like to become a director. Maybe this isn't a joke at all. After all, in Zoe's life, everything has become possible. In any case, everyone at the Zoe Magician feared and respected her. When her mother came to work, the sellers always offered a better piece of meat, or the freshest bread, or vegetables and fish without ice. After that incident, Richard, the director of the hypermarket, found himself in a difficult situation. His lack of attention to detail and lack of control over Zoe's processes became apparent. Customers began to complain about poor service, and employees became more demanding. Richard realized that this could not continue. He began to actively participate in the work of the Zoe magician, monitored supplies, trained staff, and even stood at the cash register himself, to understand what problems cashiers experience. Over time, Richard became a more responsible leader. He found a competent accounting assistant to avoid pricing errors. He also began holding regular meetings with employees to solve ongoing problems and improve the performance of the Zoe magician. Zoe, in turn, continued to be a cashier, but now her influence extended not only to customers, but also to management. Richard even sometimes joked that Zoe could replace him as director. Of course, it was a joke. After all, Zoe was too busy with her work at the cash register and solving problems to think about such responsibility. Thus, thanks to her, he became a more competent leader, and the store was successful and prosperous. Sometimes even Zoe herself was surprised at how small changes could affect big results. Zoe's mom rose from the table and extended her hand to Andrew. "Very nice, Andrew. Zoe talked a lot about you." Andrew shook her hand and smiled. "I'm pleased too, Anne. Zoe is a wonderful wife. You raised her well." Zoe caught the hint in his words and blushed. Mom smiled. "Well, let's hope that you and Andrew will be happy together. Zoe has always been persistent, and I'm glad she found such a good man." Anne sat back down at the table and poured them tea. "Tell me how you met," she asked. Zoe and Andrew began to tell their story. Anne listened, smiling. It was clear in her eyes that she was happy for her daughter and her choice. And perhaps in this chest, among the memories, their happy moments were kept, which were just beginning. Mom's chest is not just a wooden box, but a real storehouse of memories. Zoe has always been inquisitive. And one day as a child, when she accidentally opened a chest, she discovered many interesting things there. Zoe found in it old letters and postcards that her mother received from her family and friends. Zoe found a letter from her grandfather, who served at the front during World War II. In it, he wrote about his love for his grandmother and how much he looked forward to returning home. She also found an album with old black and white photographs of her mother in her youth, her parents, friends, and relatives. Zoe learned that her grandmother was a talented artist. Grandfather is a passionate traveler. Zoe examined the chest. Further in the chest were antique earrings, bracelets, and rings. Zoe learned that her mother received them as a gift from her mother, who knew the famous jeweler and often drew sketches for him. In the depths lay my mother's diary, which contained entries about her first love, about her children, and how she raised them. Every page was filled with warmth and care. Zoe leafed through the diary and could not hold back her tears. Among the things in the mother's chest were mysterious artifacts, ancient keys, coins, amulets. Zoe looked at them for a long time, trying to unravel their secrets. Mom always said that a chest is not just a storage place for things, but a place where a part of her soul is kept. And perhaps hidden in this chest are the answers to many questions that Zoe has not yet asked. Andrew, listening with interest to Zoe's stories, suddenly stood up and went to the chest. He carefully lifted the lid, and his gaze fell on an ancient compass with exquisite engraving. "Anne, can you tell me what kind of compass this is?" he asked, turning to his mother. Family Anne smiled and answered it was a gift to my father. He was a sailor and always said that this compass helps him find his way home, despite all the storms and storms. Andrew carefully examined the compass, and Zoe continued the story. Grandfather and grandmother met in the library. She was looking for a book about sailing, and grandfather had just returned it to the shelf. It was fate. Yes, it's very romantic. Andrew looked at Zoe with warmth in his eyes and told her, "Now, thanks to this compass, I will always find the way to your heart." Zoe smiled, took his hand, and Anne, watching them, thought about how important it is to preserve family memories and pass them on from generation to generation. She looked at the chest and thought that now new stories would appear in it. Stories of Zoe and Andrew. "Let's drink tea to the love that unites the past, present, and future," she suggested, raising a cup of tea. Everyone raised their cups of tea. The room was filled with the warm light of the sunset, reflected in the ancient decorations. They slept together on a wide sofa, which they folded and unfolded each time. Andrew's things fit neatly on one shelf and on several racks in the closet. The belongings were simple. Let's sleep. I have to get up early for my shift tomorrow." She clapped Andrew on the shoulder so that he sat down in surprise. She stepped into the shower and came out wearing a pretty pink robe that flattered her curves. Andrew went to the shower after it and shaved properly. He felt tired. The harsh jets of the shower gave him energy. When he came out, Zoe was already asleep, turning to the wall. Andrew lay down and, after tossing and turning for half an hour, also fell asleep. He woke up in the morning from an incredible roar and jumped up in surprise. It was Anne who dropped the metal bowl in the kitchen. She got up at 5 in the morning and, having nothing else to do, began baking pies. Today she was making another pie and accidentally pushed the empty bowl onto the floor. The noise was incredible. Most likely the neighbors also woke up. Zoe alone slept in a deep sleep and didn't even move her ears. At first, Andrew was even touched by the fact that his mother-in-law bakes pies in the morning and always has aromatic coffee and homemade cakes for breakfast. But soon, more and more often, he began to catch himself thinking that there was not enough cuteness here, and that a delicious pie could be ordered, but it was not always possible to get an extra sleep after a shift. "Zoe, let's build our own house. It will be good for Mom, and there will be space for future children. Let's. I can already imagine him. And you're smart." And she patted Andrew on the shoulder with all her heroic scope, so much so that she almost killed her husband. Andrew then rubbed his bruised shoulder for a long time. They started browsing websites where ready-made houses were sold. We started learning about mortgages. But after a week of viewings and calls, they decided that they would take their own plot and build the house themselves. For the project, they turned to the well-known Design Bureau City project. Andrew and Zoe came to the architect and explained what they envisioned for their home and how they saw it. The architect promised to draw them several plans and provide them within a week. But the project is paid. Well, let's say we can pull it off, but we still need to earn money for construction. Yes, Andrew, our salaries and my mother's pension are enough just to purchase materials for the foundation. I recently saw an advertisement that drivers are needed for long-distance flights. I have a category so I can try. Try it, but now you'll be on flights, and I'll start to get bored. But I'm for a common cause. Andrew was indignant. "Okay, you haven't passed the interview yet. And there is a chance that they won't take it," Zoe said hopefully. Andrew the day before came to the Hyde Transport Company, where he posted an advertisement for a vacancy and charmed all the girls there. Need I say that the next day he was invited for an interview? Andrew was a little worried, but remembered that they were going to build a house where they would enjoy life together, and this gave him confidence. "Hello, I'm Andrew, and I came for an interview for a driver position." He introduced himself as he entered the office. "Hello, Andrew. Come in. Sit down," answered the friendly man at the table. "I'm Alex, HR manager. Tell us a little about yourself and your work experience." "I received the category when I served in the Army. Afterwards, I worked for a private transport company for a long time, but it closed and I quit. Now I work in a hypermarket. The goal is to earn money to build my wife and I's future home." "Okay," Alex said when Andrew finished. "It's good that you are interested in money. We are looking for responsible and reliable drivers. And you make a good impression. Let's try. You can start working on Monday. Will you have time to resign and undergo a medical examination? If yes, then come on Monday with all the documents." Andrew was both happy and puzzled at the same time. He thanked Alex and returned home to tell the good news. Zoe was happy for him, but she was a little sad because she knew that now they would see each other less often. Both understood well that these were temporary difficulties and that in the end they would have a happy future in a new home. Thus began a new stage in their lives. Andrew quit the hypermarket in 3 days. He passed the medical examination in 1 day, so by Monday he had all the necessary documents in hand. On Monday he came to the office. Alex met him there and took him to the head of the transport service. He looked carefully at Andrew, as if calculating whether he would fit in the cab of the truck, and said, "Let's go get Johnson's car. He quit a week ago. The car is idle. We are incurring losses. The car has just been serviced. There shouldn't be any problems. Let's see how you do. Today we will set off on our first flight across the country. We need to transport the cargo to a neighboring city. There they will give you all the necessary documents and tell you where to go." With these words, George gave him the keys to the truck and went to the garage. Andrew followed him. They approached a lonely blue truck. "Here is your horse for the near future. The flight is given a certain period of time. If you complete it on time, you will receive a bonus. If you don't, you'll get a bare salary." When Andrew got behind the wheel of the heavy truck, he could not contain his exclamation of admiration. Everything in this car was thought out to the smallest detail: the controls, the sleeping place. There was even a small refrigerator. He turned on the ignition and the engine started. A minute later, he left the garage and drove to the address indicated by George. There he stood under the load and loaded the cargo quite quickly. A pretty girl accountant brought him all the necessary documents. She stared at Andrew while he checked whether all the papers were there. He was used to double-checking documents while working in a hypermarket. So he began to travel around the country. 6 months later, they began to give him flights abroad. The first flight was to France, where he spent the day loaded up. Andrew proved himself to be a responsible and disciplined driver. George has set him up as an example more than once. Zoe worked at the cash register, then took retraining courses and entered the economics department of the university by correspondence, so that she would later be promoted. As always, Zoe treated everything very responsibly and structuredly. Therefore, she had time to attend the construction of a house, pass a test, and combine all this with work at the Zoe store. Zoe was promoted to head of the finished products department. There were more buyers, and the finished products department was ahead of other departments in all respects. Zoe carefully checked the assortment, hired chefs and pastry chefs, and accepted the products. The news of the miracle spread throughout the city. People were traveling for delicious cakes and bread from the other end of the city. Bloggers frequented the store. They filmed stories against the backdrop of the department's windows. These stories quickly gained popularity, and there was always a queue in the department. Shortly after Andrew started working, construction on their home began to move forward. Andrew invested most of his earnings into the construction, and Zoe carefully supervised every stage of construction, paying attention to every detail. They both dreamed of the day when they could move into their new home. One day when Zoe arrived at a construction site, she felt a little strange. She was tired and slightly nauseous, which was unusual for her. Zoe decided to undergo a medical examination, and the doctor confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant. This was unexpected but good news for Zoe. She was excited and had mixed feelings. But at the same time, she was happy. Zoe waited until her husband returned from the flight and told Andrew the good news. He was beside himself with joy. He hugged Zoe and said, "This is the best thing that has happened to us recently." They were both very happy and looking forward to a new stage in their lives. Construction of the house continued, and every day they saw their dream becoming a reality. Andrew worked hard to provide for his family, and Zoe continued to study and work despite her condition. They both knew that all their efforts would soon pay off when they could move into their new home and start a new chapter in their lives with their future child. It was a time of trials and difficulties, but they were both confident that they could overcome all the obstacles in their path. "Andrew, soon we will be able to move into our house with you. I was at a construction site. The walls are ready, the roof is there, the windows are installed. By the way, I insured our unfinished construction. The girls at the Zoe Magician advised me, otherwise you never know, the building materials will be stolen. You're making progress. That's what I think. Now it's time to do the interior work, electrical, plumbing. How do you look at what I bring from my flights?" You ask? Of course, take it. And Andrew brought back good plumbing fixtures and accessories from several flights. All the latest model sockets, switches. According to the latest fashion, all this was installed by hired plumbers and an electrician. Soon all the wiring was done, and all that was left was the finishing. "Zoe, we are getting closer and closer to our dream." Andrew was happy. "We have to keep our eyes open. Otherwise, something will go wrong and we will remain like my friends." So they built and built a house, and then suddenly lightning struck, and it burned to the ground. Zoe said seriously, "I don't want that." Andrew looked at her in horror. "Who wants it?" "I have already ordered the lightning rod. I want to enjoy life in the house longer," concluded Zoe. "When will the water be installed?" Translated to another topic by Andrew. "They promised this week," Zoe answered calmly. "I don't believe that we have done so much in such a short period of time. Your job is to bring money. and my job is to wait for you and bring our child to term. Zoe Ida smiled in response. The house was ready to move in. Andrew asked George to provide a truck for the move, and he gave it. You can drive yourself, which is no more difficult than driving a truck. As usual, you are responsible for the safety of the car. The young people had simple belongings. They wanted to buy the main furniture later, once they had sorted out their debts. All things were already in the house. Andrew invited Anne to go with them, who borrowed a calico cat from a neighbor. "Mom, why do we need a cat?" "That's how it's supposed to be," Anne stated categorically, carefully holding the cat in her arms, which was lying calmly. Zoe, whose rounded belly was already very noticeable, came out of the house and got into the car. "Let's go to our house." Andrew turned on the ignition, and the SUV slowly moved away. Anne was sitting next to her, holding the cat, and Zoe was stroking her belly from behind. She didn't have much room in the front. "Are you sure you know the way?" Anne asked, looking at Andrew. "Yes, Mom. I've been there often," Andrew answered, smiling. They drove past old houses, acquaintances, streets, and soon found themselves on the outskirts of the city. Andrew turned onto the narrow road leading to their new home. The car stopped in front of a beautiful house. "Here we are," said Andrew, turning off the engine. They got out of the car and looked at their new home. Zoe took Anne's hand, and together they went into the house to fetch the cat, which Anne released ahead. The cat calmly entered. "Welcome home," said Andrew, following them. Zoe smiled, looking at her husband. They were home, and it was wonderful. It was quiet and cozy inside the house. Zoe looked around, enjoying the peace and tranquility of her new home. Anne walked slowly into the living room, examining every detail. "What a beautiful house you built," she said, smiling. "I'm sure you will be very happy here." "Mom, I won't leave you alone. You will live with us." Again, the air is clean here. The birds are singing. Andrew, standing at the door, nodded in agreement. He looked at his small family. They, Zoe and Anne, spent the rest of the day unpacking and settling into their new place. In the evening, when everything was ready, they gathered together in the living room, enjoying the smell of their new home. "We're home." "This is our new home, Mom. We haven't bought a bed yet, so we can't leave you here. Now Andrew will take you home." "Okay, children. Cat, come here." But the cat did not respond. "Kisa, where are you?" Anne asked excitedly, looking around the room. All three started looking for her, but the cat was nowhere to be found. "Maybe she went to look for her old house," Andrew suggested, but his voice sounded unsure. They went outside and called her, but there was no answer. Suddenly, Zoe heard a quiet purring, and the sound was coming from the house. They followed the sound and saw a cat sitting on the hood of an SUV. She must have gotten in there while we were inside. Anne carefully picked up the cat and didn't let it go again. Zoe stood on the porch and waved after them until they disappeared from sight. Left alone, Zoe entered the house and walked through the rooms, enjoying the silence and comfort of the new home. She stopped and looked at the window. It was dark outside the window, and only the stars illuminated the night sky. Zoe smiled and went to the window. She opened it and breathed in the fresh air. She felt a stirring in her stomach and smiled even wider, stroked her stomach and whispered, "This is our home, baby." Zoe closed the window and went to the bathroom. She turned on the water and undressed in the shower. The water was warm and pleasant. Zoe stood under the shower, letting the water wash away the fatigue of the day. She turned off the water and dried herself with a towel. Then I put on my pajamas and went to the bedroom. The bedroom was quiet and cozy. Zoe lay down on the bed and closed her eyes. She felt her fatigue slowly disappear, and she drifted off to sleep. She thought about her new home, about Andrew and her future child. She smiled and fell asleep, and I didn't hear Andrew return home. He did not wake her up and quietly lay down next to her on the sofa, since they had practically no furniture. The room was spacious and airy. The next morning, Zoe woke up to the sun's rays coming through the window. I looked at my watch and saw that it was almost 10 a.m. It was a day off. Zoe got up, went to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and started preparing breakfast. Soon Andrew woke up, went into the kitchen, and smiled. He approached her and hugged her. "Good morning," he said, kissing her on the cheek. Zoe smiled and replied, "Good morning. Let's have breakfast already." I want to eat so much. I have a little glutton inside me. She lightly nudged Andrew with her elbow, but apparently, as usual, she miscalculated the force, and Andrew bent in half. You will be left without a husband so soon. Poor him. It hurts, right? Sorry. The next day, a large bed was brought to them. Andrew assembled it himself. A couple of hours later, a beautiful white mattress was delivered, and Zoe just clasped her hands. I was completely tired and forgot about the bed sheets. I'm afraid that what we have will not be enough. Nothing, not enough, but it's there. I'll bring whatever linen you need the day after tomorrow. I'm going to Germany. Write me the dimensions, I'll look there. In the meantime, we'll sleep on the couch. There is no point in spoiling the beauty. Andrew took a tape measure out of his suitcase and measured the dimensions of the mattress. That's it. The mattress sizes are there. What is the size under the blanket and pillow? And the pillows are square. In Europe, I know that they are rectangular. Then maybe bring some pillows. Agreed. Now let's rest. We don't have a TV yet. Beauty. Andrew lay down on the bed and looked at Zoe. She turned smoothly and, like a brigantine, sailed towards him. They didn't sleep a wink all night and ended up breaking the sofa. Well, now we'll sleep on the floor. Why have floors if you have a beautiful bed? Let's lay down what we have and let's sleep on the bed. Zoe didn't mind. She took out the widest sheet and it fit on the bed. Andrew brought pillows and blankets and the two of them lay down on the brand new bed. We haven't tried it on the bed yet. Andrew smiled slyly. Be careful. I'm pregnant after all. Zoe pretended to defend herself. The bed turned out to be stronger than the sofa and withstood all the storms and hurricanes of passions of Andrew and Zoe. The next day, Andrew got ready for a flight to Germany. He already knew how to get ready quickly, and his backpack with things and a bag of groceries was already standing in the corridor. Zoe had already gone on maternity leave and therefore did not go anywhere. She was seen off at work with great regret and wished to give birth to a healthy baby. Well, you will leave, and I will remain alone in the house. I'll invite my mother to stay. You do not mind? Zoe asked. Of course I don't mind. I don't feel comfortable myself that you are left alone in the house. But we will still have to get used to it somehow, since we have already decided to live separately. I went. Don't be bored here without me. Andrew smiled, hugged Zoe, and stroked his stomach. Arriving at the base, the first thing he did was put food in the refrigerator and went to a local cafe to buy drinking water. Water was expensive in Germany, and at least he decided to save on this. Already in Germany, Andrew decided to visit a local bar in the evening to relax after a long journey. At the bar, he took a beer and suddenly noticed a girl who was sitting alone at a table and talking to someone on the phone in English. Andrew decided to come over and get acquainted. Hello, do you speak English? He asked, approaching the table. Yes, I'm from the USA, she smiled, closing the book. I'm Andrew. Nice to meet you, I'm Jane. Nevertheless, the inner male defeated the family man, whose position away from the family was very weak. Will you give me your phone number? They exchanged phone numbers, then walked for a long time along the streets of a small town in which the car was being loaded. Jane, I'm leaving home tomorrow. I would like to invite you to my place to watch the sunrise together. The proposal is expected. Do you call all girls that? She asked sarcastically. No, only you. I didn't find a better answer, Andrew. Then let's do it this way. A popular band will perform here tonight. If you get these tickets and we can go to the concert together, then I will agree. Still, you must defeat at least one dragon on the way to the Princess, Jane suggested. Accepted, answered Andrew. In the evening, Andrew emerged victorious from his fight with the dragon. He got tickets, went to a concert, and spent the night with an attractive girl. In the morning, the demands of the inner male subsided and Andrew said goodbye to Jane with a calm soul. Should I give you money for a taxi? He asked Jane. Yes, how will I go? This week I've been looking at new sneakers, but I can't decide to buy them. I'm waiting for a discount, she replied. Where do you work? Andrew asked. I work as a teacher in an international kindergarten. The salary is low. When will you come again? Liked, Andrew said with a grin. Not really, but there's definitely something about you. "I love persistent people," said Jane, took the money from Andrew and left the room that Andrew had specially rented for one night. He usually slept in his car, so as not to spend money on hotels. The car was his apartment, office and home. He left the city and began the long journey home through Germany and Poland. Andrew thought about his wife and about the future child whose father he would soon become. He brought his wife gifts and sweets which she had really loved lately, as well as things for the baby in neutral colors so that both a girl and a boy could wear them. Zoe, left alone at home, invited her mother to live with her. They spent time together preparing for the arrival of a new family member. Zoe was grateful to Andrew for allowing her mother to come stay with her. This helped her cope with loneliness and prepare for the birth of her child. When Andrew arrived, Zoe was overjoyed and Anne left. Andrew had no attraction to his pregnant wife, especially since he had only recently dated Jane. "You are so caring," Zoe hugged her husband. "I'm tired, I want to sleep." In the cabin, do you know what the dream is? Everything is noisy, rattling outside, making it difficult to sleep peacefully. Let's do it later, okay? He hugged his wife and went to sleep. Shortly after this flight, Andrew departed for France. Arriving in Paris, he decided to visit the famous cafe to enjoy the atmosphere of the old city. A girl was sitting at a table in the corner of the cafe, immersed in reading a book. Andrew noticed that the book was in English and decided to approach it. The girl had a very unusual appearance, beautiful and somehow sophisticated. "I'm Emily. I've been living and working in Paris for 8 years, the girl said. "Wow. And it's a long time. How did you get here?" Andrew was amazed. "Mom married a Frenchman. He knew that she had a daughter. He met me and allowed my mother to live with me in his house," answered Emily. "What doesn't happen in life?" "I haven't heard any stories," said Andrew. "So you graduated from a French school?" "Yes, I had to. Not without difficulty, of course. French was hard for me, but I'm still learning it." This is how their acquaintance began. They spent the evening talking, exchanging stories and impressions. Andrew was amazed by her intelligence and charm, and Emily in turn was glad to meet a fellow countryman. They began dating and soon began an affair. Again, Andrew had to rent a hotel for the night to bring Emily there. She turned out to be very skillful in love affairs, and Andrew received great pleasure from physical intimacy with her. Andrew found in this woman what he had been missing at home: passion and lack of demands. And although he continued his flights, he always found time to see her. This novel became a bright spot for him in his difficult life as a truck driver. So Andrew continued his journey, leaving a piece of his heart in every country, regardless of where he was. He always returned to his beloved women, Jane and Emily, who were for him like lighthouses in an endless ocean. Returning home, Andrew asked George for business trips to France, where Emily lived, and to Germany, where Jane lived, and constantly found a reason to stay with them for a day or two. But at home, at the base, they treated the continuation of business trips normally, and one might even say that they turned a blind eye, since Andrew worked flawlessly, loaded himself, unloaded, and everything was always on time. He crossed the border without problems, did not lose cargo, did not go on a binge, didn't make a fuss. Coming home from work after a flight, Andrew saw that Zoe had already started preparing dinner. He walked up to her, hugged her, and kissed her on the cheek. "How was your day, Zoe?" he asked, taking off his jacket. "Nothing special." "Andrew, just an ordinary day," she answered, smiling. In the evening, when Zoe was already going to bed, Andrew told her about his adventures in Germany and France. He kept quiet about Jane and Emily, not wanting to bother Zoe. Instead, he talked about the beautiful places he visited and the people he met. "And I'm sitting at home. I don't see anything except our city. Nothing. As soon as the child grows up, we will definitely go somewhere with the whole family, and you will definitely see the world." The next day, Andrew set off again. This time his path lay in Italy. Arriving in Rome, he decided to visit the famous Colosseum. He looked with admiration at the monument of ancient architecture and sat with pleasure next to him in the cafe. When I was getting coffee, I met a charming Italian woman near the bar. She was a tour guide and offered him a tour of the Colosseum. She also turned out to be a charming native English speaker. In the evening, Andrew invited Mary to dinner at a local restaurant. They enjoyed delicious Italian cuisine and wine, and then walked around Rome at night. At the end of the evening, Andrew walked Mary home and exchanged phone numbers with her. He compared Mary to Emily from Jane. Returning to the car, Andrew went to bed and thought about life for the first time. He realized that, despite all his adventures and new acquaintances, his heart will always belong to Zoe. For a moment he felt ashamed. One part of his nature demanded carnal pleasures, while the other wanted a quiet life and family. Andrew was torn between these two parts of himself and decided that after this flight he would no longer travel so far from home. He wanted to be close to his wife and unborn child. Returning home, Andrew was incredibly happy to see Zoe. It somehow warmed inside when he saw her. Soon she was due to give birth, and Andrew experienced another pang of conscience. Although he brought gifts and sweets, souvenirs from the countries he visited, he did not feel well, but Zoe was happy to see him, and was glad that he decided to stay home. Over the next few months, Andrew worked closer to home so he could spend more time with his family. He was happy, and despite all his adventures, he tried to convince himself that the most important thing in his life was his family. George liked that Andrew began to work closer to the base, because he could always be relied upon when other drivers went on a drinking binge and did not show up for work. He was thinking about making Andrew his deputy. Emily and Jane wrote to Andrew in online instant messengers, and in order not to get caught, he called everyone by male names and told his wife that colleagues from Italy and Germany were writing, asking when he would be shipping to them. Andrew tried not to think about them, to live the life of his other half as an exemplary family man. Zoe seemed to have no idea about anything. Life went on as usual until one evening, when Andrew came home from work. Anne came to visit her with a cherry pie, and Zoe suddenly grabbed her stomach. "Oh," she screamed, "I think I'm giving birth." "We need to time the time between contractions," was all she managed to say, breathing as she was taught. Andrew quickly took the phone and dialed the ambulance number. While they waited, Zoe tried to breathe deeply and evenly, as advised in the prenatal classes she attended before giving birth. "Everything will be fine," Zoe Andrew reassured, holding her hand and stroking it. When the ambulance arrived, Andrew helped Zoe up and they all hurried to the hospital. Everything happened so quickly that Andrew barely had time to collect himself. At the hospital, Zoe was immediately taken to the maternity ward, and Andrew was left to wait in the hallway of the emergency room. He sat there for a long time while Zoe gave birth, fingering the beads he bought in Italy for Zoe, and praying that everything would go well. A few hours later, a doctor came to him and said that Zoe had complications and had to have a cesarean section. Andrew felt his legs give way. "How are they?" he asked, barely catching his breath. "Your wife is fine," he replied, "but your son." He had to be admitted to intensive care. He was born weak, suffered from pneumonia, and doctors are now doing everything they can to help him. "Don't worry, everything will be fine with him." Andrew felt fear and helplessness wash over him. He couldn't believe that his little boy, whom he had never met, was already fighting for his life. He sat down on a chair, covered his face with his hands, trying to collect his thoughts. Over the next few days, Andrew barely left the hospital. He went home for a short time, took a shower, ate breakfast, returned to the hospital, where he spent time in the corridor next to the intensive care unit, waited for news about his son's condition, and also visited his wife. Finally, a week later, doctors said that the boy's condition had stabilized. Andrew saw his son for the first time through the glass of the incubator. He was so small and fragile that Andrew's heart sank. But deep down, he was sure that his son was strong and could handle everything. Andrew was allowed to touch the child through the round holes in the cuvette. After he washed his hands with soap and treated with an antiseptic, he tremblingly touched the little body, and he was overcome by a wave of love for this little creature, which connected him with Zoe. "My boy, my son," Andrew whispered, stroking his son's leg. The son was fast asleep, holding his arms close to him, and inside Andrew there was a desire to protect him. Zoe and the baby were transferred to the second stage of nursing to another department on another floor. "Andrew, the doctor said that we will spend at least 3 weeks here," said Zoe. "Well, it's necessary. You call, tell me what to bring, I'll bring it instantly," Andrew said. "It's better here than in the postpartum ward," Zoe said, stroking Andrew's hand. Andrew brought water, fruit, baby canned food, and condensed milk to the hospital for Zoe, diapers, wet wipes, and pacifiers for the baby, who was named Victor the Winner. 3 weeks later, Zoe called Andrew. "We are being discharged today. Can you come and pick it up?" "Certainly." "What question?" "I expected that you would be discharged around these days and asked you not to put me on long-haul flights." An hour later, Andrew arrived to pick up Zoe and his son. Anne arrived with Andrew. She cried, looking at tiny Victor. "Stop it. All the bad things are over." "Yes, I'm crying with happiness because I see my grandson." On the day when Andrew held his son in his arms for the first time, he felt that the whole world around him had disappeared somewhere, and only he and his son remained. And all his adventures and travels are nothing compared to this moment. He realized that the most important adventure of his life was just beginning. And it's an adventure to be a father. I felt like a captain on a ship whose crew had mutinied. Put aside your tears. Still good. Come on. He put the bags on the floor and hugged both women. "Let me put the child in the car seat I bought. And let's go already. Because I'm nervous, I want to eat. I'm hungry." Zoe took Victor out of the envelope and the two of them placed him in the car seat. Andrew carefully buckled his son in and made sure that the seat was properly secured. "We can go," he said, sitting in the driver's seat and looking in the rearview mirror. "Please drive around the potholes more carefully. Don't brake suddenly," Zoe asked. "Everything will be fine. I'll drive so that the glass of water won't spill," Andrew assured. Indeed, the car drove so smoothly that everyone began to feel like they were sailing on a ship. When we arrived home, the women were dozing, but they woke up and went out. Andrew unfastened the baby and handed him over, and he took the bags out of the trunk, took them, and followed his family into the house. Little Victor was a sickly and very loud baby. He screamed almost continuously, day and night, so that Andrew could not sleep properly. Zoe and Andrew took turns getting up at night to see the child, but in the morning Andrew couldn't really wake up. He catastrophically stopped getting enough sleep. It got to the point that he once almost knocked down a lamppost while stopping by to unload. After this incident, George called him to talk. "Andrew, I understand everything, a small child, all that. But that's also not possible. You need to get enough sleep. Hire a nanny. You make good money," said George. "Sorry, this won't happen again." "I wanted to ask you to send me on long-haul flights again," said Andrew. "That's a different conversation." "Is there anyone to help your wife?" George asked. "Yes, Mom will come to her for a while," answered Andrew. "Then this week we will have loading to France." "You already went there," said George. "Great. I'll go get ready." Andrew's mood has noticeably improved. His other part of the active male hunter was bored and yearning for new adventures. "Hello, wife," said George. Andrew received his travel allowances from the accounting department and went to work. When he returned, he parked his truck on the territory of the base and affectionately stroked it on the cold metal of the cabin. "Well, old lady, will we be on our long journey again soon?" "Are you ready?" he asked. Scania, of course, remained silent, but Andrew, always carefully prepared for long flights, checked all the systems of his Swallow and knew that he could trust it. Arriving home late in the evening, Andrew immediately went to the room where his son was sleeping. Zoe sat and rocked his crib. Just fell asleep. "I called my mother. She will come to me tomorrow," she said. "Go get some sleep, and I'll sit with him," Andrew answered. Zoe happily lay down and slept for several hours. Victor was snoring quietly in his crib. Andrew looked with emotion at his son, at his body and tiny arms and legs. He could not believe that he was a father. He made sure that everything was in order, lay down, without undressing, on his side, next to his wife, and instantly fell asleep. Early in the morning, Andrew got into the cab and drove out onto the highway. He was very glad to be back on the road, where new adventures awaited him. His path lay in France, in Paris, where a meeting with Emily awaited him. Andrew liked the French roads and the scenery on both sides. In a Parisian suburb, quite large rabbits grazed on the hills. They calmly and melancholy chewed the grass, and were not at all afraid of passing cars. Upon arrival in Paris, Andrew unloaded the car and immediately headed to the cafe, where he and Emily agreed to meet. He entered and his gaze fell on Emily, who was sitting at a table by the window. She was as beautiful as the day he first saw her. "Hello, incomparable Emily. I see your eyes still sparkle like two diamonds," Andrew exclaimed, approaching the table at which the girl was sitting. She turned around and smiled when she saw him. "Andrew, wow. Long time no see." Hi. "Don't tell me these diamonds are 2 carats, she said, standing up to hug him. They hugged. And Andrew felt his heart beat faster. He was happy to meet Emily again. They spent the evening and night indulging in lovemaking and reminiscing about old times and sharing news. It was a joyful meeting. The next morning, Andrew woke up in a hotel room next to Emily. He looked at her and felt the joy of owning a beautiful woman. He was proud of his love victories, and Emily was one of them. "Good morning, honey," he said, kissing her. "Good morning, Andrew," Emily answered, smiling. They spent the morning together, had breakfast in a cafe, and walked through the streets of Paris. Andrew was happy to date her because the relationship was like an adventure, which he loved very much. In the evening, Andrew returned to his cabin and prepared for the long journey back home. He was tired but happy. He knew that a long and difficult road awaited him, but he was ready for it. His path lay across Europe, and he was looking forward to meeting new people and new adventures. After driving through France, he stopped for the night near the German border, planning to meet Jane tomorrow. She has already written him a message saying that she is waiting for him and is counting the hours until his arrival. Waking up early in the morning, Andrew at first did not understand where he was. That was how deep his sleep was. He was awakened by a message from Jane. "Good morning, are you awake yet? I hope you had a good rest because you will need a lot of energy in the evening at the cafe in the parking lot." Andrew took a shower and quickly had breakfast, after which he left. An hour later, he was already in the city where Jane lived. He parked the car and went to the central square, where they agreed to meet. The decoration of the square was the old town hall with a clock. Andrew loved to walk there and look at the residents of this city. Jane appeared unexpectedly, also oriental, smelling of freshness. Andrew inhaled her scent and, without much conversation, hugged her and kissed her. She was different from Emily, but she was also very attractive. Andrew didn't have much time to meet Jane, so they didn't waste any time and headed straight to the hotel. They ordered food and drinks to the room. Jane liked Andrew, his way of communicating with women, his intensity and passion. She secretly dreamed of persuading him to marry her, although deep down she knew that she had very little chance of this. In such rare meetings, she agreed to the role of temporary refuge, because Andrew made her feel that she was desired and loved. Andrew looked after her beautifully, bringing small, nice gifts, silk scarves, pendants, bracelets. When they left the room and said goodbye, Andrew went home with a sense of accomplishment. All the way he was proud of himself, but felt guilty before Zoe. He justified his adventures with his masculine essence. "Well, this is the kind of male I am, and this is how I was, and this is probably how I will die." During the journey, the feeling of guilt went away, and everything that happened seemed to have never happened. Maybe it was, but not with him. It was not him, but another part of him. And now Andrew is driving both an exemplary family man and an excellent employee. Andrew was so confused about his women that he sometimes called them by other names in his sleep. The one who heard someone else's name was jealous and offended. Andrew consoled her as best he could, trying to appease her with affection and increased attention. And I thought to myself, so someday I'll call Zoe by someone else's name. And this will be the beginning of the end. I will lose both my wife and child. At work, meanwhile, the number of orders in Europe increased. There were complex flights when cargo from one city had to be transported to another, where the next cargo had to be picked up and transported further, and so on. The flights were tedious, sometimes taking months or longer. Many drivers refused them because they were very tired, but Andrew agreed, knowing that at home he would always be welcomed with open arms, no matter how much he travels through foreign lands and roads. Moreover, this is a great opportunity to make money. Meanwhile, while Andrew was sleeping, Zoe accidentally discovered his correspondence with Emily. She took Andrew's phone to check the weather forecast because her phone was dead. For some reason, my husband's phone was not blocked. And when Zoe was looking at the weather for the week, suddenly a message came from Andrew's contact. "I miss you so much, I can't forget our last meeting." My tiger, she stared at the smartphone screen in amazement, and an unpleasant feeling rose inside her. Zoe looked at all the correspondence and was horrified by what she saw. Next came a message from contact Leonid. He also wrote, "Beloved, when I fall asleep, I think about you and everything in the same spirit." She imagined scenes of revenge, one more terrible than the other. But she didn't want to do any of this. Then, after thinking carefully, she came up with a sophisticated revenge plan for his husband, which was supposed to shake him up thoroughly. Andrew was fast asleep. After a long journey with the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and cherries was heard. This mother was baking her signature cherry pie again. Zoe adored him. "Zoe, come in and have some tea." Victor fell asleep. Anne called her into the kitchen. "You don't have a face. What happened?" "Yes, Mom, it happened. My husband, it turns out, is cheating on me. And you know what's worst is that he has several mistresses. 2, that's for sure. Or maybe more. This happens in life. Daughter, the main thing is, don't be upset. Men can be very temperamental, and one woman is not enough for them. Are you protecting him? No, you just can't fix nature." Anne remembered her husband, who had mistresses before her, during her time and after. "Have you already figured out how to take revenge?" Anne looked at her daughter carefully. "Yes, Mom. And you will help me with this," said Zoe. Victor woke up and loudly demanded attention. Zoe went to him and fed him. The baby calmed down and fell asleep again. "Mom, just don't let Andrew slip." "Fine." When Andrew woke up and went into the kitchen, he found 2 women there drinking tea and cake. They both looked at him strangely and smiled mysteriously. "Why are you both so strange?" Andrew asked in surprise. "We just discussed one series in which a man went on business trips and had a mistress in different cities. So he drove between the house and them until one fine moment he was caught by the husband of one of his mistresses. He simply put her out on the street, wearing what her mother gave birth to. That's a male, isn't it? You're not like that with us. Are you a good husband and father?" Anne said. "Yes, not like that," Andrew answered, trying not to look at Zoe. "Pour some tea. I really want to try your cherry pie." They poured him tea and gave him a large piece of pie, which he ate very quickly. "This is divine baking. You need to open your own candy store, Anne. There would be no end to buyers." There were 3 days off after the flight, and Andrew decided to devote himself entirely to his family. He walked with Victor, helped with housework, and was the most caring and helpful. Zoe was already starting to doubt it, but she heard an SMS arrive. "I still have to put my plan into action. Otherwise it won't end well." 3 days later, Andrew was leaving on a long flight, which was supposed to last, according to rough estimates, at least a month. There were difficult domestic flights and loaded stops. Zoe packed him a whole bag of food, put a pile of clothes, and sat down next to the baby's crib. Andrew gratefully accepted everything that Zoe did for him, and again a worm of conscience began to stir inside him, which he successfully strangled. "At the end of the day, I'm a temperamental man, not some kind of impotent. I'm not going to get a divorce to marry one of them." "I never dreamed of this. Even in a nightmare," he consoled himself. He set off on the voyage, intending to end his relationship with his 3 passions. He couldn't make any decision. Or rather, he did not want to accept it. It was just easier for him. As soon as he crossed the border, he forgot either about Zoe or his mistress. He traveled through Germany, France, and Italy and met with all 3. Made each one happy. Everyone got their share of joy. After these meetings, he suddenly felt exhausted, and he desperately wanted to go home to his loving wife and child. He began to lie to everyone and say that he had to leave tomorrow. There were several trucks in the parking lot, the drivers of which were resting. Under the canopy there was a small table at which sat a group of men talking. Andrew decided that he didn't want to eat alone now, so he took his food and joined the group. The men took him in and put all the food in one pile, from which everyone took and ate. Andrew also put his supplies into the common pot. Can you imagine? I come home, and there I am having fun with my former classmate. Oil painting. I, of course, kicked out both lovers. Gave my wife a hard time, said the big guy in the vest. Divorced? The bald man asked him. Beaten up. So she's still afraid of me, the big man answered. Guys, don't you cheat on your wives on business trips? Asked Andrew. We are a different matter, we are men. That says it all, and we always exercise caution, the big man explained. After lunch, everyone went to their cars. Andrew also climbed into his sleeping bag. He kept thinking about their conversation, and was even afraid to imagine his Zoe in the arms of another man. I forcibly drove away such images from myself and even dozed off for a while. But I woke up to someone knocking on the cabin door. Andrew looked outside. A big man stood near the car and held a kitten in his hands. Nailed in the parking lot. I have 2 cats and a dog at home. I have nowhere to take it. Maybe you'll take it. Don't even know. When I was a child, I had a cat. Then he left somewhere and never returned. Probably got hit by a car. Wait, I'll bring you food. I bought it on my way. Yes, you need it now. The big man went to his car and returned carrying 2 bags of food in his hands. Here you go, it's with beef. Mine love these canned goods. Is this a cat or a cat? Andrew tried to look, but the kitten held its tail tightly and scratched desperately. The girl, I called her Marquise, answered the big man. How did you manage to meet her like that? Or have you been standing here for a long time? I've been waiting 3 days for the documents to arrive from the farm. We messed something up. We went to fix it, the big man answered. It's clear. Okay, I'll take your awning. I'm going home anyway. We have our own home. There is a place. Andrew thought about home, and his heart immediately sank. He remembered the conversation between the men at dinner, and he felt cold inside. He was in a gloomy mood the entire way back. Only the Marquise consoled him. She was very calm. The cat sat and slept in the front seat or in a sleeping bag. During stops, he would take her out for cat activities to feed and water her. The Marquise ate with pleasure the food the big man gave her. Arriving home, he entered the gate, went to the front door, but stopped at the threshold. Then, pushing aside the annoying thoughts, he stepped inside. What he saw inside horrified him. Zoe was sitting on their favorite sofa, with a huge man hugging her shoulders. Zoe laid her head on his shoulder and said something affectionately to him and stroked his head. He recognized the man as a neighbor from the house across the street. The blood rushed to my head. Andrew let go of the Marquise, who jumped to the floor, and then jumped onto the sofa, on which a happy Zoe was sitting. Zoe turned around to see who had arrived and saw Andrew. The cat is out of the house, the mice dance, Andrew said angrily. What is this about? Zoe asked, as if there was no one in the house except her and Andrew. What kind of cat is this? My God, how pretty. The name of. The neighbor took the Marquise in his arms and began scratching her behind the ear. The Marquise was tormented and basked in his arms. Now he took my cat, you bastard. Andrew rushed at his neighbor with his fists. The neighbor dodged and laughed, which sent the already enraged Andrew into a complete frenzy. Andrew grabbed a chair and chased his neighbor. The Marquise jumped off the sofa and quickly hid under it. Zoe squealed. Victor began to cry in the next room. Suddenly, Zoe stood up and stunned Andrew with one powerful blow. He fell to the floor, not understanding anything and holding his ear. Zoe, what are you doing? For what? Andrew asked his wife in bewilderment. This is for your colleagues. Which colleagues? What are you talking about? Andrew tried to get up, but Zoe didn't let him and sat down on top. Sorry, I accidentally read your correspondence. It's just that while I was checking the weather, I received an SMS from my mistress, and then another one. Zoe, I'll explain. Andrew didn't even try to free himself. There is no need to explain anything. You've lost my trust. I believed you. As I thought to myself, my husband earns money abroad, and he hangs around with women there. Everything is on time. And how do you have the conscience to look me in the eye, male? Yes, Zoe, you are completely right. I am a male, and probably nothing can correct my essence. But you're good too. As soon as I was out the door, you immediately brought a man into the house. How should I understand this? Zoe did not answer immediately. Andrew, tell me how you felt when you saw a strange man hugging me. Like what? Jealousy. Anger, of course, what else? Then how do you think I should feel when I found out that you have 2 mistresses who are waiting for you somewhere far away? Or will you say again that this is something else? Do you understand that you hurt me? My heart is broken. I don't know when I'll be able to trust you. By the way, the man is our neighbor, Michael. He and I agreed to act out the scene in front of you. And in my opinion, it was a success. So it's all not true. Michael, sorry. Andrew walked up to Michael and extended his hand. Michael shook hands in response. Nothing. Happens. Understand. Michael rubbed his bruised shoulder. That is, I'm the only one who changed here. The fact is that I do not perceive this as cheating, but rather as satisfying the need for sex. Do you want me to understand this and forgive? Sorry, but I can't do it yet. I pack my things and leave with Victor to visit my mother. For now, live alone and think, let me know how you decide. Zoe began walking around the apartment, collecting things to move. Maybe it's better if I leave? No, I decided so, and it will be my way. Move away. Andrew was at a loss. Michael left quietly. The Marquise crawled out from under the sofa and quietly made a puddle near the table. What should I do with you now? How do you get used to the litter box? I don't know a thing. Andrew went for a rag and a bucket and began to wipe up the puddle. In order not to sit at home, Andrew decided to take the Marquise to the veterinarian. He examined the cat and gave the name of the medicine to treat the ears. Fine. Tell me, when can she be sterilized? She appears to be about 3 months old. Bring it back in 6 months, if you don't feel the need first. Andrew arrived home and saw that Zoe had packed her things and the baby and was waiting for him. Andrew, with his head down and looking like a beaten dog, carried his things into the trunk, put Victor in the car seat, and waited for Zoe to get into the car. They drove in silence the entire way. Zoe looked out the window and pretended to admire the scenery. Andrew didn't want to say anything or make excuses. When they arrived at Anne's house, the neighbors were sitting on a bench at the entrance and fell silent in bewilderment when they saw Andrew carrying things into the apartment. And when he carried it and went down to get into the car and drive off, they began to whisper. They just got married. They're already running away, one neighbor said. How do we know? Maybe the house is being renovated, another suggested. Upon arrival at her mother's, Zoe laid out her things and settled into the room. Andrew helped unpack things and set up a crib for Victor. Zoe silently began unpacking things and putting them on the shelves. Zoe, I don't know what to say. Forgive me, please, Andrew began. Sorry. Do you think an apology will fix everything? You understand that you violated my trust and caused pain, right? Zoe answered, not looking at Andrew. I understand that I made a mistake. I didn't mean to offend you, I just didn't think. I do not know how to explain it. Andrew tried to find words, and I thought about you every day. I believed you and waited, and you lied to me, deceived me. Zoe, I don't know what to do. I love you and Victor. I regret my actions. Please give me a chance to improve. Andrew's plea sounded sincere. Chance. Do you think you can go back and forget about what happened? It is not so easy. Andrew, I need time to digest everything in order to understand what to do next, Zoe said with sadness in her voice. Over the next days, Andrew came and tried to help in the house, look after Victor and support his son. He tried to be attentive and caring. However, Zoe remained cold and distant. He understood that he had lost the most precious thing in his life because of his action. Now he had to realize his mistakes and cope with the consequences of his action. Andrew worked hard and thought a lot. He even started going to see a psychologist. He did not believe in psychologists, but several meetings completely changed his mind. He finally figured out what he really wanted for himself. A few months after Zoe left, Andrew decided to write a letter. In this letter, he expressed his deep remorse for his actions, admitted his mistakes, and asked for forgiveness. After sending the letter, Andrew waited anxiously for a response. A few days later, he received a response. In it, she expressed her gratitude for his words and efforts, and also wrote that she was ready to give him a second chance. Zoe came to visit Andrew a few days later. He waited impatiently for what she would tell him. Zoe put the kettle on, put the cake that Anne had baked, and 2 cups on the table. Sit down, we will talk and discuss our future with you. They spent long hours talking about the past, feelings, and what happened. Zoe realized that Andrew had changed internally. She still loved him, did not want to leave, but the pain from her husband's betrayal did not allow her to forget his offense. At the end of the meeting, Zoe said to Andrew, I won't forget about the past, but I'm ready to give us a chance to start over with a clean slate, but remember, it will be a job for both of you. She rose from her seat and poured some food for Marquise. Andrew realized that she gradually began to forgive him, and this made his love for life only stronger. The one who forgives a lot loves more. He remembered the words from the Bible. Together they went for things. Together they brought everything back into the house. Zoe busied herself putting things back into the closets and shelves, then went out with Victor for a walk. The weather was sunny outside. Zoe saw that neighbor Michael was digging beds on his property and decided to greet him. "Michael, good afternoon. We're back. How are you doing?" "Everything is fine. We are returning to normal life," answered Zoe. "I wish you success," said Michael and returned to his garden. A taxi pulled up to the house and Anne got out. She came out holding flat cardboard boxes. They contained pies. Andrew went out to the pie and was amazed. "So, son-in-law, on your advice, I opened a pastry shop. I make pies. You were right. There is no end to the buyer. I brought you my new items. Try it." "That's the news. Congratulations." "Well then, come on home, we'll drink tea." He took the boxes from Anne's hands and led her into the house first. Suddenly, a message came to his phone from his mistress. Andrew looked and blocked the contact. After thinking a little, he also blocked the contact of the remaining two. "We have to start everything from scratch. There is no place for old sins," he decided. A widow with many children was weeping bitterly at her husband's grave, and as soon as her shoulder was touched. For 4 years, Joyce had not believed in happiness. Once she had everything a woman could wish for: a loving husband, Albert, 3 wonderful children, a beautiful flat in the center, exotic trips once a year with the whole family to the end of the world, an expensive car. But everything changed dramatically when Albert died. The man was coming home late at night. A meeting had gone long. At work, he never particularly did not spare himself, realizing that a large family must be decently provided for. The job took up a lot of his time, but even with his busy schedule, he found days that he could devote to Joyce and the kids. That unfortunate night, Albert sat behind the wheel very tired. Their company was preparing for an important project, so the man hadn't slept much in the last few days. The road was empty, so at some point Albert relaxed and apparently lost his guard. He simply did not notice the impending danger. At the junction, a lorry slammed into him at full speed. There was no chance of survival. Looking at the traffic camera footage, Joyce realized that if Albert had slowed down for even a fraction of a second before the junction, the terrible tragedy would have been avoided. Inattention and fatigue were to blame, as well as the lorry driver who had arrogantly hoped to run through the junction on red. "There's no point in blaming anyone now. Albert can't be brought back." It took Joyce a long time to accept what had happened when she received a call from the police. The woman was convinced that she had been the victim of a prank or fraudsters who swindled gullible relatives out of money by reporting trouble with family members. But something in the caller's tone alerted her. Senior Lieutenant Morris, as the man had introduced himself, was waiting for her at the district morgue. It took Joyce 10 minutes to get there, almost getting into an accident on the way. She entered the building on woozy legs. "This is crazy," the woman told herself. "This is a mistake. Albert's at work. He just got held up." And the fact that the phone was silent was just to keep her busy. Joyce, a man's voice called out to her. Turning round, Joyce saw a young boy standing in front of her. If he hadn't unfolded the law enforcement badge, she would never have believed he was an officer. Joyce, Senior Lieutenant Morris continued. "My name is Ethan. You and I have been chatting on the phone." Yes, Joyce responded uncertainly. "Where is he?" "Ethan, can I see him?" "Perhaps that's not the best idea," the young man replied, somehow embarrassed. "You see, the accident is terrible. There's hardly anything left of the car. And your husband. I've called you in now, rather to identify your personal belongings. I don't think it's wise to identify a body in your condition." Everything inside clenched. Joyce didn't understand how anyone could speak so callously about her husband. She still held out hope that someone else had died. There weren't many other Albertans in their big city. The policeman led the woman into a small room. Another young man sat at a desk, concentrating on typing something into his phone. Kyle Morris addressed him. "Get the evidence bag." Kyle lazily pulled open a desk drawer and extracted a clear plastic bag containing some red-stained items. "Here, Joyce, take a look at this." Ethan began laying the contents out on the table. "Do you recognize any of these items?" She was about to declare, without looking, that this was the first time she'd ever seen any of this. But then the gold pendant she'd given her husband on their wedding anniversary caught her eye. The woman reached for the shiny rectangle, but her legs gave out. Ethan managed to pull up a chair for her. Everything in front of Joyce's eyes swam. She drank the water offered by the policeman. "Yes, those are my husband's things," the woman spoke in a trembling voice. "We need to make our way to the station now, fill out paperwork, and watch the security footage," Morris addressed her. Joyce didn't care anymore. Her whole world had collapsed overnight. What did she care about paperwork? She had fallen into a kind of half-remembered oblivion and reacted to the words of the staff, clutching Albert's pendant tightly in her hand. All she cared about now was how to tell her children that their daddy was gone. After the funeral, Joyce had stopped caring about what was going on around her. The children were looked after by a nanny, and Joyce herself began to drink in secret. To the housekeeper's criticism of her constant pulling of bottles out of the bin, the woman did not react. She locked herself in her room and spent long hours looking at pictures of their once happy family. This went on for months. Waking up on a frosty winter morning with a severe headache, Joyce felt as if she had woken up. She looked around at the mess around her and cried. Only now did she finally realize that Albert would never again come into their bedroom, hug her, or call her to eat the cheesecakes he always made for the family on weekends. When the woman left the room, the first thing she did was head to the kitchen. Everyone in the house was still asleep. The clock showed only the beginning of 7. Joyce was determined to prepare her husband's speciality. Her relaxed body didn't obey her. It was only on the 3rd attempt that she managed to knead the dough. When the last cheesecake was transferred from the pan to the plate, Catherine came into the kitchen. Her eldest daughter was 8, but she was remarkably advanced for her age. "Mummy?" The little girl wondered. "Are you up already?" "Yes," Catherine, the woman, tried to smile and hugged her daughter tightly. "I wasn't feeling well, but I'm fine now." "You made Daddy's cheesecakes," Catherine wondered. Of all the children, she was the only one to realize that her father was gone. James, who was only 5, cried for a long time, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Elizabeth was just a baby, unable to comprehend such information. "Mummy, are we going to have things back to normal now?" Catherine asked hopefully. "Yes," Catherine. Joyce sighed heavily. "It won't be the same. But we're strong, aren't we? We'll try to manage somehow." Catherine sat looking at her mother with a confused look. The girl could hardly believe her words. The woman had lost a lot of weight. Always neat, stylish hair turned into some kind of crow's nest. Under the eyes, darkened horrible circles. Her hands were treacherously shaking. "You know what?" Joyce suddenly suggested. "Why don't we have a beauty day this morning? Just the two of us." They used to have this kind of entertainment regularly, having been the first in the family. Catherine had everything a little girl could want. Therefore, hearing her mother's proposal, the daughter, without hesitation, agreed. While they were talking, James and Elizabeth entered the kitchen, accompanied by Cassandra and the Harrison family's invariable nanny. His brother held the little girl's hand with care, leading her like a princess. "Mammy," the little one shouted with glee as they embraced her. They were used to seeing their mother in the kitchen in the mornings. Joyce rarely left the room, trying not to let the children notice her condition. "My good ones." Joyce smiled as she hugged the little ones. "Good morning, Cassandra." "Good morning. I see you're in a good mood today," Cassandra replied gently. There was relief in the woman's eyes. She had been worried about Joyce lately. She had been working for the family for 8 years now. In that time, she had grown accustomed to everyone as family. With Albert's death, everything had changed. But watching Joyce fade away was unbearable. Cassandra had moved in willingly to help out and take on some of the responsibilities of a hostess. "Aunt Cassandra," Catherine said to Nanny, "Mummy and I are having a beauty day today." "Oh, you don't say, my dear." "It's about time. It's better than being cooped up in 4 walls." After breakfast, Joyce and Catherine went on their beauty expedition, as they called their visit to the salon. Joyce was quickly tidied up and Catherine had her charming braids braided. However, there was a hitch at reception. "Ladies, the payment didn't go through," said the receptionist, smiling guiltily. "Let's try again. It happens sometimes." When the payment failed several more times, Joyce became seriously worried. Taking cash out of her purse, the woman paid. Getting into her car, she called the bank and reported her problem. Joyce, the employee, answered politely, "You see, the account to which your card is linked has been frozen. I can't give you the details over the phone. Come to the office." Joyce and Albert shared an account. The woman never gave much thought to how much money was in there, knowing her husband made a very good living. The message about the freeze left her confused. Of course, it's some kind of technical glitch, the woman convinced herself. Now I will go to the bank and find out everything. But the bank said nothing comforting. On the contrary, the situation seemed much worse. The account was arrested and blocked. Albert had some debts that Joyce had no idea about. They never had any secrets from each other, the manager said monotonously. Even if you inherit now, you can't unfreeze the account. By law, debts are inherited too. So what's left? Either sue, trying to recover the money, or accept it. Neither of which Joyce was happy with. Suddenly fear came to her throat. What is this? The woman thought with horror. There's no money. What am I supposed to do now? Joyce had never worked, having been fortunate enough to marry a wealthy and promising man. A student, Joyce initially worked part-time as a translator, dreaming of a career as an international translator. But her husband was adamant. I am capable of providing for you so that you will not deny yourself anything for the rest of your life. Joyce never went to work, and then Catherine appeared, and the woman devoted herself entirely to her family. Joyce grinned. For the rest of her days. Who knew how things would turn out? Right now, the woman was concerned about the children. Of course, there was some cash at home, and the jewelry could be sold. Enough for the first time, but money was running out at supersonic speed. Used to living large, Joyce didn't know where her finances were going. At some point, she suddenly realized that she had run out of money altogether. The jewelry had been sold. The contents of her husband's safe were rapidly melting away. There was nothing to do, so she went to Cassandra for advice. Cassandra, the woman, began softly, stepping noiselessly into the kitchen, where the nanny was preparing something. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Joyce, why are you so frightened?" The lady standing at the cooker literally jumped up and down. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Joyce tried to justify herself. "I've got something to talk to you about." "Yes," the nanny said, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Joyce didn't know where to begin. But there was no one closer than Cassandra right now. She was the only person Joyce could talk to normally. "Cassandra, I don't have any more money on me," she began. "What do you mean, Joyce?" And the woman looked at her understandingly. "What do you mean you don't have any?" "I always thought Albert was earning enough to give your grandchildren a good old age." He did. Joyce sighed, but he had some debts. Huge debts. "I've been to the bank and all the accounts are blocked. I've been spending the cash in the safe for 2 months now. I've sold most of my jewelry." "Joyce, are you serious now?" Cassandra exclaimed as if she couldn't believe it. "Why didn't you tell me before? It's not a minor problem. You have children." It was embarrassing. Joyce excused herself. "I've never been very good at counting money. It was Albert's job. He never let me in on things. Turns out money does run out. I don't know what to do now." "You have to get a job before it's too late," Nanny said firmly. "A job?" "I've never had a job," Joyce replied. "You know, I got married straight out of college. Albert wouldn't let me earn my own money." "Well, you have a good specialty," Cassandra said. "There's always a need for translators." Cassandra didn't give up. "Where would they take me? I graduated 10 years ago. No experience, nothing." Joyce disagreed. "It's okay," the nanny continued. "Work on the internet. I think translations are always in demand. Anyway, you never know without trying." "That's true," Joyce sighed. "Do you think it pays all right?" "It's all right. It's not all right. It's enough to live on. You'll have to tighten your belts, of course, but it's up to you, you know. I won't leave you in the lurch, but it's time you got things under control." "Hello, Martin." Joyce was visibly agitated as she dialed the number of her husband's friend and companion. "This is Joyce Harrison," she introduced herself. "Joyce, hello. Where have you been?" The man was very surprised. "I rang. You didn't answer the phone. I haven't seen you since the funeral." "Well, I was in such a state I didn't want to see anyone," Joyce sighed heavily. "Martin, I need to talk to you. It's a serious problem. I think you can help me." "No problem," Martin answered in a confident tone, giving Joyce hope. Half an hour later, Martin was in the flat. It had been 6 months since he had visited his friends. Without Albert here, everything seemed somehow alien. The men had been friends since high school. They'd been through a lot. They opened their own business, shared both profits and losses. After the wedding, Albert was a little distant, but Martin did not take offense. He understood everything. He had no family of his own. His personal life was replaced by his favorite job. Joint business did not connect them for a long time. He accumulated capital. Albert went on a solo voyage, engaged in real estate, and Martin remained a small businessman. But doing what he loved, it didn't affect their friendship. "What happened to you?" the man asked. Martin Joyce began. "Tell me, did you know anything about Albert's business?" "What do you mean?" "Well, I was at the solicitor's yesterday. I'm about to inherit the estate. It's been 6 months. I've got to make it official," Joyce suddenly stammered. And Martin didn't quite understand what she was getting at, or what it was about the inheritance. What's the next step? Isn't it a joy to get millions and not know where to put it? So she turned to an old friend for help. Joyce continued. "No," Joyce said in a tone that alerted Martin. "You see, Albert had huge debts. He never said anything to me about it. So I was wondering if you knew anything. They showed me some papers, some loans, some private loans, some receipts. And now I've got to pay it all back. "What are you talking about?" Martin was genuinely surprised. "What debts? I always thought that you were doing very well. I was jealous, to be honest." "So? It's a lot of money. Astronomical. I don't understand it myself. I thought he was making good money." "I spoke to Jack, his assistant, well, he told me that Albert had been really looking to expand lately. He's probably got the money to do it. I just can't understand why he didn't do it on behalf of the company." "I take it you're worried," Martin said. "And how much is there to pay?" "A lot to pay out," Joyce sighed. "They've blocked all the accounts, but I'm still short. I think I'm going to have to sell the flat." "Really?" Martin was genuinely surprised. The sum seemed to be really impressive. In his estimation, the Harrison flat was worth a lot. Center, prestigious building, huge space, designer finishes. Joyce had told him how much he needed to pay off his debts. Martin even whistled in surprise. "Tell me, will you help me with the deal?" Joyce asked. I don't know anything about this sort of thing. I'm afraid of running into crooks and losing the price." "No problem," Joyce said persuasively. "Tell me, where are you going to live? Maybe a cheaper option. I realize you're used to luxury, but you don't have much choice now. As they say, it's not a matter of living large, it's a matter of living well." "Of course, Martin. I've had to say goodbye to luxury," Joyce agreed. "And it would be nice to have enough for a 2-bedroom in the suburbs. There are 4 of us, after all, but there's no need to consider a decent one." "I understand," Martin nodded. "I'll try to find suitable options." "All right, I'll get started right away so it won't take too long. Let me take a picture of the flat. I've got a good realtor in the neighborhood. He won't let you down." Mammy James interjected, "Where's my room?" "This is where you and Catherine will live." Joyce opened the door to the tiny bedroom. "We'll put the beds here, and there's a table and a wardrobe." "No, I don't want to live with Catherine. She's mean and greedy. I want my room back." The little boy whimpered. "Honey, we're going to live here now. Don't you love it? Look how green the yard is. You'll even have your own tree." By your own tree, Joyce meant a huge cherry tree, whose branches were literally breaking through the window of the future nursery. "And Elizabeth?" James persisted. "Elizabeth will live with me. There's plenty of room for us." Trying to smile, Joyce answered her son. Catherine entered the room. The girl's face showed that she was not happy about her new home either. "Mama," she began, "tell me, are we poor now?" "What are you saying?" Joyce tried to evade, though she knew it was useless to deceive her daughter. "Well," Catherine looked at her seriously, "the whole flat is smaller than our kitchen. And we drove an hour to get here. Why are we moving?" "Mummy, I'm not stupid. Just tell it like it is." Joyce took her daughter aside. She didn't want James to get hysterical when he caught some of the phrases. "Daughter," she began, "I don't want to deceive you. You're right, we don't have any more money. It's just the way things are. But now we have to learn to live again. I had to sell the flat. A lot of things will change. But the important thing is to stay together. Isn't it?" Joyce looked hopefully at her daughter. The girl's mind was going through an intense process. She seemed to be relating what she had heard to everything that had happened lately. For a moment, her eyes lit up. "Aunt Cassandra isn't coming back, is she?" Catherine asked disappointedly. "If we don't have any more money, we won't be able to pay her." "Catherine," Joyce hastened to reassure her. "Cassandra won't leave us. We're like family to her. It's just that we will see her less often because she will have to work somewhere else. But she'll be happy to come round at weekends, won't she?" "Who's going to look after Elizabeth and James then, whilst at school?" the girl asked. "Well, I'm working at home for the time being, and then I'm thinking of putting them in kindergarten," her mother said with sincere faith in her voice. "And you yourself are ready to move to a new school?" continued questioning Catherine. "Mummy, I understand everything. I'm already quite big," she said in a serious tone. "What does it matter where to study? I can think for myself." Sometimes Joyce was amazed at how mature her daughter was. They couldn't afford the old grammar school. Thank goodness they had managed to get the child into a neighborhood school, which was really quite good. But still, it is a stress for the girl, accustomed to classmates and individual approach of teachers. And with kindergarten for the younger ones, it was necessary to solve something. It turned out that it was not enough just to bring the children. The queue was huge, and Joyce could not afford a private institution. The cost of attendance seemed exorbitant. And then there were the two children. Cassandra's services, of course, had to be dispensed with as well. The kind woman had agreed to help with the household chores, but Joyce felt she had no right to exploit her all the time. She managed to find some work, but translations from French were of little interest now. Everywhere there was a need for specialists in Asian languages, of which the former student had only a vague idea. Anything she could earn was gone in a flash. The money left after paying all Albert's debts was barely enough for a small flat in a residential area and a small reserve, which Joyce put aside for the last resort. There was still a car, but a woman with 3 children didn't want to deprive herself of mobility, although the maintenance of a premium car also cost a lot of money. Attempts to get an official job as an interpreter in an international company failed. Seeing a spectacular, well-dressed woman, job seekers managers willingly escorted her to their offices, but her lack of experience and 3 children immediately turned them against Joyce. After a few such interviews, she gave up trying. Such conversations hurt her ego. So, and remained, in his opinion, forced to work part-time casual translations of modern French authors. The editor was in no hurry to pile orders, so the cash flow in the family did not turn into a stormy river. 6 months after the move, Joyce realized that the money is catastrophically lacking. She still had to sell the car, exchanging it for a simpler car. The school Catherine went to, although it was not elite, still required huge expenses. They were constantly collecting money for repairs, for gifts for teachers, for something else. The last thing Joyce wanted was for her classmates and teachers to be prejudiced against Catherine because of her family's difficult financial situation, so she paid all the exorbitant fees. "That's the way it is in all schools," Judy, an old friend who was one of the few people Joyce kept in touch with after her husband Albert's death, once said. The rest of her friends had evaporated as soon as they felt there were no benefits to be gained from their relationship with Albert. And the widow might ask the widow for a loan. No one was in any hurry to part with the money. Joyce was a proud person, but nobody cared much about that aspect. So she was left with her university friend Judy, Martin, and Cassandra. They supported the single mom as best they could. But in today's world, it's hard enough to stay afloat without a financial backstop. "You know what, Joyce?" Judy continued. "I've got an acquaintance who's opening a private kindergarten with some experimental methods of education. Not many clients yet, as the prices aren't too steep. Maybe I could put in a good word with her about your kids. She is a person who understands, responsive and in trouble, will not abandon. I think we can negotiate a discount. You still have to find a job, no matter what. With the kids at home, it's out of the question. That's true, Joyce thought. But I doubt if I can afford even a small amount of money. Please leave that to me, said Judy. I'll arrange it. We'll make it all right. I can't help you with the job, unfortunately. You know I'm not very good at it myself. Just as Judy had said, the owner of the daycare center had come to an agreeable arrangement. Joyce was relieved to trust the children to this woman, who, as it turned out, lived nearby and even offered to bring them home. Joyce immediately started looking for a job, hoping for some prestigious, high-paying position. It didn't work out. First, she got a job as an administrator in a beauty parlor, but she couldn't work there for a month. The relationship with the owner, who for some reason immediately disliked the newcomer, did not work out. Joyce did not have any working specialty, although there were a lot of similar vacancies, and the salary was promised to be good. There were still options, which the woman was prevented from considering by her pride. But could a person with a higher education go as a cashier or food packer in a supermarket? Joyce tried delivery, so popular with the younger generation, but after a few orders brought to her old acquaintance, she gave up the idea. And it was costing a lot of money in petrol. Joyce, let's go to my office, as a manager Martin once suggested to her when he dropped in for tea. We've got a girl going on maternity leave. I wouldn't want to bring in someone from outside. It's not a difficult job. Of course, I can't offer you a huge salary, but a full social package. Weekends like normal people, free meals. Sure, I'll go, Joyce agreed without hesitation. That's how she joined Martin's firm. Things were not going well at the new place. No, the woman coped with her duties in full. But relations with her co-workers had been frayed from day one. All the women working for Martin were convinced that Joyce got her position because of the chief's favor. Some ladies were openly jealous of her striking appearance and were quick to invent another unflattering gossip about her private life. But Joyce paid no attention. All she was interested in was how to feed herself and her children. Besides, her job left her enough time to do translations. However, the woman had no weekends at all. Even joint walks with the kids remained only a dream. Thank God, Cassandra came to the rescue, helping to make ends meet. Joyce had learned to live without her husband. "Mummy," Catherine said from the doorway when she saw Joyce staring at her laptop. "I don't think you've forgotten, but I'll remind you. James turns 9 this Sunday, and we haven't even bought him a present yet." It's like Joyce woke up. "Are you serious? Sunday already? What's the date today?" "Oh, Mum, you're so funny," she marveled at her daughter. "Greetings to distant space travelers from Earthlings. On our planet today is Tuesday, the 4th of September. The time is 1837. "I'm really confused about the days at work," Joyce confessed. "It's been a nightmare today, and I've got a translation due. I couldn't get round to it." Joyce seemed exhausted. In the 4 years she had spent as a widow, a lot had changed in her life. She still worked for Martin. She was no longer the office manager, but his personal assistant. Her salary was rising in line with inflation. Joyce still hadn't learned how to cope with the problem of being broke. Catherine had become a teenager with growing needs. James had already started 3rd grade, and Elizabeth would be starting school next year. Joyce worked hard to give her children everything they needed. But quality clothes and newfangled gadgets cost a lot, and the woman did not want her favorite offspring to stand out from their peers. Of course, Catherine constantly argued with her in the shop, choosing things simpler and cheaper. But Joyce couldn't be persuaded. "Let me finish early tomorrow," her mother continued. "You and I will go shopping and pick out something interesting. Do you know what he'd like?" "Oh, Mum, Joyce. Shame on you. You've forgotten all about us. You don't even know what your son is interested in." That's it, said Catherine. "I'm joking. I understand perfectly well. You're not a little girl, I know everything. I'll show you when we get there. We'll have to stop by the Albion shop." "All right, my daughter, whatever you say," gave up mother. "There should be enough money. I hope I've been saving." Catherine vanished out the door, leaving Joyce alone with her thoughts. 4th of September, the woman reflected. After all, the day after tomorrow will be 4 years since he's been gone. We'll at least have to go to the cemetery. Joyce went to her husband's grave once a year. She couldn't stand it any longer. To see his smiling face etched on the black granite slab. She couldn't. Immediately, a heavy wave of memories of the past came crashing down on the equally hard granite of the present. She had never taken the children with her. Only once Catherine had traveled with her, but seeing her daughter's tears was even more unbearable than her husband's stony smile. After leaving work early, Joyce took her usual route. Martin, having learnt where his assistant was going, offered to give her a lift. But it was important for Joyce to make the journey alone. There were no traffic jams yet, so she reached the cemetery quickly. On the way, she stopped at a flower shop and bought 4 snow-white roses tied with black satin ribbon. The shop assistant smiled sympathetically at her, adding even more tragedy to the situation. At the cemetery gate, Joyce did not see the typical picture of peddlers soliciting paper flowers. The beggars and cripples that usually sat along the paths were not present on a weekday. Only the sounds from the granite workshop and the few wreaths gathered near the entrance reminded her that this place still had something to do with the world of the living. Joyce walked with an uncertain gait, noting on the way the landmarks she remembered from her previous visits: the lush fence, the graves of some authority figure from the 90s, the sad angel mourning a 5-year-old girl who had left the world. A rubbish bin topped with a pile of colored funeral wreaths. Spotting a bifurcated birch tree, the woman turned onto the path on the right. Here we go, just a little further and I'll be there, Joyce thought, sinking her heels into the soft ground. The birch trees were already beginning to turn yellow. Ahead could be seen a granite slab gleaming in the sun, casting a sort of sombre golden glow. 2 huge ravens sat on the table, eating something left over from an offering to the dead with gusto. There were plastic bottles lying everywhere, wilted flower heads, dry branches. Doesn't anyone really clean up around here, Joyce thought. Is it so hard to take the rubbish away with you? Well, here I am, she said in a shaky voice, squatting down in front of the ever-smiling Albert. I'm sorry I'm alone and haven't been here in a while, love. I brought flowers. I know you didn't like them much, but it's tradition. With those words, Joyce put the roses in a jar of water, putting aside the withered remains of the ones from last time. And the children are all grown up now. Catherine's a real bride. You wouldn't even recognize her. She looks just like you. The woman pulled out her phone and started flipping through pictures of the kids. James is 9 now. Yesterday I went with Catherine to pick out a present for him. You'd think your son was into aeromodeling. They got him a plane like that. Catherine said he'd jump through the ceiling when he saw it, and Elizabeth is a year away from school. She's smart. She's already reading and writing. I even do French with her sometimes. Joyce sighed heavily, wiping away her tears with the palm of her hand. She didn't know what else to say to a dead man. All this superstition had never appealed to her. Even as a child, going to the cemetery with her relatives, she hadn't understood these meaningless conversations with the earth, libations of vodka on the grave, greetings and farewells. Well, a man is gone, he's gone. What can be done about it? What does he care about the survivors now? How am I doing? Joyce said, answering her own question, supposedly asked by the silent interlocutor. Same old, same old. I'm working for Martin. I don't know where we'd be now if it weren't for him. I don't make a lot of money, of course, but it's enough to live on. Cassandra's been very supportive. She's retired and often takes the younger ones to her cottage. I took them all summer, teaching them to garden. Elizabeth couldn't get out of the berry patch. And James has learnt to swim. I'm thinking of enrolling him in the pool. He needs sport anyway, Joyce said. For about 15 minutes, she sat in complete silence, immersed in her memories. The birdsong put her in a sort of meditative state. Suddenly, this calm was broken by a crackling noise. Joyce gave a startled shudder and looked round. An old man was standing not far from her, looking at her hesitantly. I'm sorry to startle you, the elderly man addressed Joyce peacefully. You see, it's Thursday. There's nobody here. And I'm lost again. I'm so lucky to have met you. No, not at all, the woman replied. You didn't scare me at all. I was just thinking and didn't expect anyone else to be here. Can I help you? If it's not too much trouble, could you help me find my wife's grave? It's been so many years and I keep getting lost in these gravestones. It's like she doesn't want me to see her like this." The old man smiled embarrassedly. Yes, of course, Joyce agreed, rising from the ground. "Well, Albert, goodbye, I'll be off. I promise not to be discouraged. I'll give the children a hug." Joyce walked towards the old man, shaking off the hem of her cloak. She noticed he was holding a tiny bouquet of lavender. What a thing, she thought. I wonder where he found these flowers. And they don't look artificial. "My name is Winston," the older man introduced himself. "And I'm Joyce." "Nice to meet you," Joyce Winston said. "I'm sorry we met in such a peculiar environment," the old man said apologetically. "I see you're interested in my flowers." To be honest, yes, Joyce nodded. "I didn't think you could find lavender in our town at this time of year. Even abroad, it's out of season. Are you interested?" I am. Winston smiled. "When my late wife and I went to Provence, we visited the lavender fields. The guide told us that these flowers are rarely found outside the country. They don't take root anywhere, that the climate is not suitable, or something else. So I was surprised it's just lavender. I grow them in my own greenhouse." "All right, well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what about lavender?" "My wife was very fond of lavender," Winston said. "I didn't share that sentiment. But I can't come here empty-handed. I'd like to make her happy." "Mary," he corrected himself. "Oh yes," the old man was worried. "Let's try to find the tombstone. I used to turn off at that stone bollard over there, but it's all changed in a year. It's weird. I can't find a white marble monument, not very tall, and there's a wrought iron bench next to it." "Mary." Joyce looked around. She'd never taken much interest in who was buried next to her husband. A couple of rows to the right, she spotted several similarly described monuments and immediately headed for them. On the third try, she found the right grave. "Winston," she called out. "I think I found it. Come here." The old man wandered slowly between the rows of graves, trying not to stumble on the grassy paths that were slippery from the recent rain. "Hello, Mary," he said cheerfully, kneeling down on the ground. "Again, you didn't want me to come, and very wrongly. You're always thinking of yourself. You know what? I'll find him." Joyce was looking at the photograph on the monument. It was of an elderly but strikingly beautiful woman. There was something subtly oriental about her appearance, and her eyes were laughing, filled with childlike joy. Judging by the date on the plaque, the woman had died 10 years ago, and also on the 6th of September. As you can see, Joyce thought, that's quite a coincidence. I wonder what it was from. She wasn't very old. She must have been ill. Suddenly, the old man's voice broke the silence and interrupted her thoughts. He spoke in French. The last thing Joyce had expected to hear was French poetry. Not just any poetry, but an extract from a famous poem by Arthur Rimbaud, to whom she had dedicated her thesis. "Rolling tides and in winter's cold." I ran, baffled as the mind of children and peninsulas, breaking away from the land, had not learnt the triumph of such wild passions. By itself, Joyce's translation of the stanza spoken by Winston succeeded. The old man froze, slowly turned his head in her direction, and looked with surprise at the woman for whom it had cost nothing not only to recognize a rare poem, but also to reproduce it in Russian. Well, he said. "I see you like Rimbaud?" "You see," Joyce replied, sitting down on the bench. "When I was a student, I studied French, and this poem by Rimbaud was the subject of my thesis. I'm literally fascinated by this young poet, because he didn't have much else to write. And this poem left a significant mark on French poetry and literature in general. To say that I was surprised to hear it here now, and in excellent French, is an understatement." Yes, Winston laughed. There are coincidences in life. And how can you not believe that everything in the world happens for a reason? Joyce, that poem. Mary was literally obsessed with it. My wife had an excellent knowledge of French, and as a young woman, she was fond of translating the classics. Then one day she came across Rimbaud, and you realize how difficult it was to get hold of such literature, even for students. She read the translation, but it seemed to her that it did not convey the essence of the original, and Mary was a very persistent and determined girl. So she decided to create her own translation. I have an old notebook at home in which my wife wrote down her versions, but she was never able to perfect them, as she thought. It would be very interesting to see it, Joyce said. I touched on the subject of translation during the defense, but it was about the popular versions. I'm interested purely from a professional point of view. If you're really interested, then you're welcome to visit, Winston replied. I live alone. My son got married a long time ago and moved to the capital. He visits once every couple of years, Winston continued. I'm afraid to fly. I've never even seen my grandchildren in person. Mary's gone. I'm a recluse. My friends have all left this world long ago. If it's not too much trouble, come and see me. I live near the Central Library, you know. Maybe the house with the columns in the original? I know, Joyce smiled. The old man's offer might have seemed dubious to some, but the woman felt that the man was very lonely, and the sincerity with which he told her the details of his life was endearing. Besides, Joyce really wanted to look at Rimbaud's translations. Her professional interest was making itself felt. I'll definitely come. Let's do it tomorrow at 5 o'clock. It'll be convenient. I'll have a couple of hours to spare. Of course, assured her old man. Come, I'll treat you to a specialty coffee, a woman's recipe. I'll leave you my phone number. If anything changes, let me know. The new acquaintances stayed at the cemetery for some time, and then Joyce kindly offered to give Winston a lift home. All the way he told her about the peculiarities of growing flowers in the greenhouse. Joyce had never realized it could be so interesting. She returned home in high spirits. Catherine had already come home from school. We must eat quickly, Joyce said. Mother and daughter went to the kindergarten. Elizabeth managed to get into a fight with a boy who was pulling her braids. The conflict ended with a torn shirt. The child's angry mother demanded compensation from Joyce for the spoiled item. Unwilling to listen to an explanation, Joyce silently pulled out the money. Noticing that the purse was almost empty, she muttered. Yes, it's still a couple of days before payday. She didn't scold Elizabeth, noting only. A real lady would not defend her honor with her fists, but would seek revenge using her intelligence. How's that, Mummy? I don't understand. You and I will definitely talk about it, but a little later. But I'm still glad you didn't let yourself be offended. Mum, Catherine intervened in the conversation. Why did you give that bitch the money? It's clear that it's her child's fault. If you'd stayed out of it, you'd still be in one piece, Catherine said. Sometimes you have to give in, said the mother. I realize what a conflict would lead to now. We'd have a fight with her. She still won't admit that her son is at fault. After all, then I will question her love and methods of upbringing. And there's no way to prove anything to an offended soul. He'd end up attacking Alex again tomorrow, only with his mother's encouragement. And now we'll teach our princess how to take revenge on the offender without using fists, so that she won't bother again. And this, as you called her, bitch doesn't have enough brains to realize that her son was insulted. Well, Mum, Catherine stretched out, laughed. What a sly one you are. Having finished her work, Joyce remembered that she had promised to stop by Winston's. She called her eldest daughter and arranged for her to pick Elizabeth up from kindergarten, telling her that she would be a little late. Mum, Catherine piped up, Are you late for work, or are you going on a date? What date, baby? Joyce laughed. I've got an appointment. I'll try not to be long. Okay? All right, Catherine whispered, don't worry. Joyce bought some cakes on the way. She didn't want to go to the house empty-handed. She knew a good bakery that sold inexpensive but delicious sweets. She liked to take her children there when she had free time for a joint day off. The woman parked in front of the impressive stuccoed front door, noting that the house where the old man lived did not look simple, even by modern standards. In the old days, representatives of the ruling elite diplomats, academics, high-ranking officials lived in such Stalinist high-rises. But today, only very wealthy people could afford a flat in such an architectural object. Winston lived on the 7th, top floor. Joyce took a rare lift with a sliding cast-iron grill and noticed the rich decoration of the stairwell. The walls were decorated with moldings, the marble floors were clean, and each door had a gilded plaque with the initials of the owners. When she rang the bell at the door that said Winston lived behind it, The woman waited a long time for the door to be opened. Winston greeted her with a broad smile. The old man was dressed in an immaculately tailored gray woolen suit that made him look much younger. "Good evening, dear Joyce." The man greeted her. "I didn't expect you to come." "Why not?" the woman asked, embarrassed. "Well, you'd have to admit, meeting in a cemetery is a rather dubious way to start a relationship," the older man smiled. "Though, considering the way life flows nowadays, it's surprising that strangers can even talk to each other and find a common theme." "I confess," Joyce replied, "I am driven by professional interest, and I'd like to try your advertised coffee. I brought some cakes too." "Thank you." Winston took the bundle of treats. "Please come in." Joyce walked into the huge living room. The flat had high ceilings of at least 4 meters. One wall of the spacious room was completely filled with shelves of books. On the shelves were whole collections of rare editions, which the owner of the library had collected for decades. There were even some ancient-looking medieval manuscripts and editions with traces of time on their covers. Apparently, the owner of the flat was a man extremely well-read. The order of the bookshelves made it clear that the contents were not just decoration or an attempt to impress. "I see you like my little collection?" Winston asked, bringing trays of coffee and sweets into the room. "It's quite small," Joyce said, still looking at the books. "There are at least 2,000 volumes here." 3,047. "To be exact," said the old man. "There were more, but when Mary died, I donated some of it to the university library, as she had willed. And now that I'm retired, I can't afford to read as much as I used to. My eyesight's not what it used to be. And you know, it was more interesting to discuss what I read with Mary than to be alone with my opinions. Sometimes I'd open her favorite illustrated editions and just admire the drawings. Here, for example, Winston reached for one of the shelves, where there was a whole collection of brightly colored covers decorated with golden Arabic ornaments. Winston displayed Tales of 1001 Nights, an amazingly beautiful full-size book covered in silk with a glossy marbled insert depicting a tent in a flowering garden. "It's a 1913 French edition with illustrations," he said. "Oh my God, it's beautiful." Joyce marveled. "I'd never have realized that such copies were in private collections. It's a work of art." "You're right," smiled the old man. "Such collections can easily be sold at auctions for decent money. Today there are no more than 5 complete collections of such books. But I will not sell my fairy tales for any money. You see, they are not just well-preserved volumes, they are memories. Moments of happiness, forever gone, but also forever in my soul. Mary and I bought this collection in Paris, would you believe it, at a flea market, and for only 300 francs. Although at the time it seemed a fabulous sum to us. When Soviet citizens got to foreign countries, they bought everything that was different from their usual life. But for some reason, Mary and I did not go to fashionable shops and perfume shops, but went straight to hunting for antiques. The seller asked 400 francs for the books, but we had only 300 francs left. Seeing the fire in my wife's eyes, the merchant could not stand it and gave in. Probably then he regretted 1,000 times, because today the cost of such a collection is at least 30,000 euros. "Oh, really?" Joyce marveled. "Is it really true?" "It's true," sighed the old man. "So what good is money if you can't buy anything with it? Think about it. How can I, an old man, afford such a sum? It won't bring me joy. Shall I put it in the bank? What for? For a funeral, maybe. Because it's expensive. And it's expensive to send yourself to the next world for that kind of money. I'm not some pharaoh." Joyce laughed. Winston was right. She wondered what she would have done herself. If she owned such expensive books, she probably wouldn't hesitate to sell them. He's the one who doesn't need the money. Joyce has children to raise. Every penny counts. That kind of luxury is a thing of the past. What if the books belong to the children? Joyce wondered. Then, no, not at any price. It would be too low. She'd be better off scrubbing floors. She wouldn't sleep at night, but she wouldn't deny her family the right to such a treasure. Winston sipped his tea from a fine china cup. "Oh, what lovely coffee!" Joyce exclaimed. "I've never tasted anything like it." "I'm glad you appreciate my specialty recipe," laughed the old man, "though it's not quite right to call it your own. I learned to make coffee this way from an old Arab named Amin. His coffee shop was located in one of the old neighborhoods. Arabs appreciate coffee. For them, it's not just a drink, but a whole culture. How interesting, Joyce exclaimed. Have you traveled a lot? A lot, Winston sighed. But Algeria is a special subject for Alice and me. You see, she was an interpreter at the embassy. She was sent to North Africa right after college. At that time, the Union was actively establishing relations with the Arab states. There weren't many specialists. That's where she and I met. And you're a translator too? Joyce was surprised. No, not at all, smiled the old man. I was an archaeologist. An archaeologist? Joyce marveled. Yes, I agree. It's not an ordinary profession, Winston replied. For a long time, our group had excavated all over the United States. My specialty is Orientalism. I lived in Uzbekistan for a long time. We found a lot of stuff there. But in the 70s, I received an unusual offer from my university to go to Algeria to excavate in Jamil. Of course, I agreed. It was practically impossible to go abroad at that time. I should not have refused such a chance. An interest, you can't deny it. But here we went to Africa. At first, of course, everything seemed wild, especially the unbearable heat and the absence of the usual amenities. We drove into the mountains. It was very hard to get there, and to be honest, it was scary. The very terrain and people were frightening, and our guide looked like a criminal. Jamil is an ancient Roman city. They began to study it in the early 20th century, so we were not pioneers. But we had to take into account that Algeria is not a developed country. No roads, no proper shops, and it's in the middle of nowhere. We had to carry all the luggage, provisions, and equipment on our backs. We had a few mules. I'm still amazed at how hardy they are. And Norman, the guide, even though he had a creepy appearance, turned out to be a reliable man. He saved us from many dangers. We were several months away from civilization, surrounded by ancient ruins. There were ghosts and creatures everywhere. But the scariest of all were the nights, or rather the cold that came with them. It's unbelievable when the temperature rises to +50 during the day and drops below 0 at night. In the mountains. Of course, it's a peculiar pleasure. But we were young and brave and obsessed with digging. How did you and your wife meet? Joyce asked. And Mary? Winston sighed. Mary and I first met when our group was on its way home. The old man drew in more air, as if preparing to dive underwater. After a long pause, he began his story. The excavations at Jamil were a success. Winston's group managed to find the remains of thermal baths and well-preserved mosaic floors. They even managed to get hold of a few clay jugs, which were quite well preserved. Such a find was rare, so the archaeologists were already preparing to rest on their laurels of glory, having taken several hundred pictures, published dozens of articles in magazines, and carefully packed their equipment. The group intended to make the return journey in the morning. The last night began as usual. At first it was sharply cold. The guys built fires, cooked dinner, and sat down to tell stories. Life stories quickly became boring. Then the interpreter Norman began to pester Sid to tell them something interesting about this place, something he had encountered himself. The guy did not agree for a long time, but after persistent persuasion and a couple of shots of vodka, his tongue was loosened. I had just started taking scientists to the ruins, Sid began. My first group was 4 young Frenchmen, Sid said. The War of Independence had just ended. The atmosphere here was not the most favorable, but I liked that these young people were free of prejudice and didn't hold their noses. There was a photographer among them. I think his name was Jean, though I could be wrong. They reached Jamil quickly. It was the beginning of September. It was not very hot during the day, so it was easy to walk. The boys set up camp at the site, and I went to harness the mules. What's stopping us here? Norman asked quickly. So it was decided to start the work in the morning. We were sitting by the fire, as we were now, and preparing to go to our tents. Suddenly, one of the guys noticed that Jean was gone. When the photographer left, no one noticed. At first, we thought he had gone to sleep in the tent. He didn't turn up. We went round the neighborhood, calling for him, trying to find him with torches, but no luck. The guy was gone without a trace. It's not hard to get lost here, but there's a risk of wandering into the mountains and falling into a crevasse. Sleep was out of the question. Every minute counted. We split into pairs and continued our search. Francois and I went into the mountains, and the other two lads went to explore the ruins. When dawn broke, my partner and I returned to camp. As we approached, Luke, one of the guys who had gone to the ruins, came running towards us. He was waving his arms and shouting at us to hurry up. We ran after him toward the amphitheater. There on the steps sat Eugene. His head was as white as chalk, though only yesterday he had been a burly brunette. He was frantically clutching his camera and muttering to himself the word Mopana. The guy seemed to be unable to see anyone or anything around him. His pupils were severely dilated and his lips were chapped. He did not respond to our words. We got him to the camp, gave him tea and put him to bed. By morning he seemed to have regained consciousness, but he remembered nothing at all. Perhaps he had managed to photograph something, but I was not to find out. As soon as the guys left, I never heard from them again. Sam broke the silence around the fire. You know, I went out of the tent last night to take a leak, and just in the area of the amphitheater I saw some kind of glow. I thought it looked like the moon was setting, even though it was overcast. What if it was haunted? That's a bit of a stretch, Sam said Norman. There's no such thing as ghosts. Yeah, Winston, the leader of the group, said skeptically. He had always thought such stories were rubbish. He wasn't going to believe them, but he couldn't sleep well after what he'd heard. When all the boys had gone to their tents, Winston lay still for a long time, wondering what the Frenchman could have seen in the ruins that he had turned gray overnight. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a crackling noise from the street. He poked his head out of the tent, but it was empty. Only the embers of the fire were slowly going out. He was about to climb back in when the crackling sound came again. The sound was loud and distinct, coming from the direction of the ruins. But no Winston muttered, climbing out of the tent. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like it was coming from the other side of the world. The boy did not wake anyone, and, armed with a strong lantern and a stout stick, set off in the direction of the amphitheater. There was someone in the center of the structure. Winston froze, not understanding how a person could be here. The logical explanation was that it was someone from the camp, but the figure was dressed in something light-colored, covering almost the entire body. Winston gripped the stick tighter and aimed the beam of light at the man sitting below. "Hey, what are you doing here?" shouted the archaeologist. The figure didn't move. Oliver sank down a couple of steps and froze, sweating with fear. Had the boys decided to play a trick on him, knowing how he felt about all sorts of mysticism? "Norman," he shouted. "If they're trying to scare me, it won't work. I'm going to use this stick." Winston confidently ran down the steps and approached the figure, swinging the stick. Suddenly, the figure rose sharply and turned round. The lantern illuminated a woman's face covered in blood. Winston stepped back, paralyzed with fear. The woman stared at him in silence. "Who are you?" Winston spoke in plain English. "Do you need help? We have a first aid kit. I'll get it for you. Just don't go anywhere. Do you understand me? I'll be back." He was about to leave when suddenly the woman grabbed his arm and addressed him in clear Russian. "You're not a hallucination, you're real. Are you here alone? I didn't hope for help anymore. You see, our motorcade was attacked. We were on our way to Seattle, but we got trapped on the way. Some men pulled us out of our cars, started pushing us around, trying to get us into their truck. I managed to get away. You see, it's getting dark fast. I know the city's not far away, but I'm totally disorientated. I came across these ruins and decided to wait out the night. But it's very cold. If it wasn't for you, I think I'd have frozen to death by morning." Only now Winston noticed that the stranger was wearing a silk business suit that was stained and torn in places, and what he took for a blanket was a jumper and an Arab headscarf. "Lord, let's go to the camp," Oliver exclaimed, taking the woman under his arm. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she answered. "Only my heel seems to be broken." Winston helped her to the camp, lit a fire and sat her on a bench. From the tent he got 2 blankets and a first aid kit. Treating the wound on the stranger's face, the guy saw that she was still quite young, no more than 25 years old. "What is your name?" asked the archaeologist. My name is Winston. I am an American archaeologist who by fate found himself in this wilderness. And I'm Mary. The girl answered and even tried to smile. It was obvious that she was still frightened. Mary Smith. I work at the American Embassy as an interpreter. We traveled from Algeria on a diplomatic mission to a local university. But as I said, we were attacked on the way. God, what about Sebastian and the others? She continued confusedly. I'm the only one who escaped. The girl appeared greatly disturbed. Winston, too, was alerted to the fact that bandits might be lurking nearby. Of course, they had a few guns in the camp, but they could hardly serve as a good defense. There's no point in worrying about that now, the archaeologist said hastily. You can't help anyway. Tomorrow we will go down to the city. And there we will think what to do in this situation. Right now you should be glad that you were not captured by these bandits and did not die in the mountains. Norman's head emerged from the tent. Loud voices woke him up. The others also seemed to wake up. In a minute, the whole group was already sitting around the fire. They were surprised at the appearance of a woman in the camp, and a very beautiful one at that. Nobody fell asleep till morning. First, everyone listened to the story of the appearance of a stranger in the camp, and the remaining few hours were on duty. In the morning, the archaeologists loaded their loads onto mules and set off for town. Mary was placed on one of the pack animals, and Winston walked beside her, ready to support her at any moment. You know, if Syed hadn't told us that terrible story the night before Winston began, I'd be fast asleep. I'm afraid to imagine what would have happened to you. What was the story? Mary asked. Was it about ghosts in Roman ruins? Exactly, laughed the boy. I don't believe in all that, of course, but somewhere inside there's still hope that there's something left after death. And I believe that we don't go away forever, she said sadly. At the gendarmerie, Mary explained at length to an officer in mirror-polished shoes and white gloves. What happened yesterday? The officer called somewhere several times, making the girl languish in suspense. Winston never left her side. The rest of the guys had gone to a hotel to rest. He realized there was no way Mary could be left alone. After a couple of hours spent in the station, it was learnt that the diplomatic motorcade was attacked by a group of radicals opponents of the ruling party. At that time, relations between the United States and Algeria were developing very unfavorably. But there were those who were against it. The diplomats were taken prisoner and ransomed. Mary got through to the embassy and learnt that the negotiations had been successful and that her colleagues would soon be safe. The other end of the line was very happy to hear that the girl was all right. They offered to send a car for her, but Mary refused, preferring to get to the capital by train. Winston was very pleased with this option. It meant that for some time he would be able to continue his acquaintance with this amazing girl. After all, his group also had to take the train to get to the international airport. In the capital, Mary escorted Winston to his flight. Before boarding, they exchanged addresses and phone numbers. A year later, the girl returned to her homeland. By that time, between the young people, there were real feelings. And Winston, in order to please his beloved, even began to learn French. Mary was transferred to the consulate. She sometimes had to go to North Africa, but most of the time she spent in the United States. Winston tried to match his expeditions to his friends' business trips. So it turned out to spend more time together. 2 years later, lovers played a wedding. Winston did not dote on his girlfriend. The girl shared all his hobbies, charged love for her own, so the newlyweds always had something to talk about. Hot arguments caused a discussion of literature. Mary passionately collected books, and if Winston preferred history and architecture, she grabbed every volume of poetry. On their honeymoon, they managed to go not anywhere, but to France. For American citizens, such a trip was something from the category of fantasy. Not everyone could afford to see the Eiffel Tower, but Mary's job at a foreign consulate was a great advantage. She was offered to accompany a high-ranking official to an international forum. The event was to last 3 days, and Mary could stay in a foreign country for another week, and to her great joy, she was allowed to take one relative with her. While his wife attended social receptions, Winston wandered around Paris, took lots of photographs, and practiced his conversational French. A simple American was fascinated by this majestic city. Architectural delights struck his imagination, and people conquered by their hospitality. When Mary's official activities were over, the couple could finally enjoy all this splendor together. The young wife dragged Winston to flea markets, museums, and cozy coffee houses. And at night they took long walks along the Seine embankment and dreamed of the future, enjoying the present. A year later, the couple had a son, Alex. Mary was over the moon with happiness. She inherited from her grandfather a huge flat in the center, where the couple immediately moved. Winston was swamped with work. He was sent to Fort Worth, near which were large-scale excavations of ancient sites. For 5 years, he was home for a maximum of 2 months a year. Mary almost completely took over the upbringing of her son, but even such long absences could not spoil the relationship between the spouses. On those rare days when Winston was home, he tried to make up for the entire period of his absence. Mary and little Alex marveled at how Daddy had so much energy and ideas for things to do together. He organized large-scale excursions around the city, took them to the countryside, arranged some fantastic costume plays at home, and still as heatedly argued with his wife about literary preferences. Finally, his forced exile ended and Winston sighed calmly, except that it became uneasy outside the window. The country was about to undergo a change of power, which some awaited with excitement, others with fear. By 1985, Winston, who successfully defended his doctorate, has already led his own archaeological unit at the university. He rarely traveled to the field, swamped with paperwork. By that time, the man had not yet turned 40, so he was very frustrated by the lack of practical research. Mary continued to work at the consulate, where she returned after her maternity leave. She didn't even have to worry about a position. There were only a handful of specialists like her. And thanks to her natural charm, even conflicts between delegations could be resolved. Alex was already in the 3rd grade and proudly wore a bright red pioneer tie around his neck. Unlike his parents, the boy had an extraordinary passion for English. Mary did her best to send him to one of the most prestigious language schools. By the standards of society, their family was considered exemplary, intelligent, educated, beautiful. The neighbors were especially envious of the fact that the couple never quarreled. Quarrels simply did not fit in their heads. How could they quarrel, living soul to soul? But the couple paid absolutely no attention to what was going on around them. Even suddenly fallen on the country, hard times could not break their strong family. When what was considered an unshakable power began to fall apart, Winston lost his job. No one cared about the ruins of the past when the ruins of the present formed all around. The couple were lucky. Mary was offered a long-term business trip, this time to Canada. The woman agreed without delay, realizing what could happen in her native country in the coming years. The most painful part of the move was perceived by Alex. By that time, he was going through a difficult period of teenage maximalism. Especially, he was in love with his classmate and almost ran away on the eve of the flight. But Winston had a serious talk with his son, convincing him of the need for a temporary move. In Canada, the boy came in handy excellent knowledge of English. He quickly adapted to school and made new friends. Winston managed to get a job as a consultant at the Faculty of Archaeology at the University of Montreal. The couple returned to the States only in 2008, when the country was recovering from another crisis. Alex stayed in Canada, by then enrolled in college. For some reason, Mary was sure that her son would never return to the States. As it turned out, she was right. Alex finished college in Canada, then got a job in New York, married well, and only occasionally came to visit his parents. The couple returned to their luxurious flat, which had been rented for the past few years by a German diplomat. Mary was delighted to find that her favorite books had literally been dusted off. The life of husband and wife flowed again in the usual course. Winston found an interesting niche for himself, consulting and organizing private archaeological expeditions, the demand for which increased sharply by 2000. At home, he only had time to wonder where, and his wife by that time has already passed the 50-year milestone, so much energy. The woman left the civil service and took up tutoring. She liked teaching students French. Young people listened with interest to her stories about her amazing travels in French-speaking countries. And then a terrible thing happened. Mary had a stroke. She was completely paralyzed on the right side of her body. It happened on 6th September 2002. Winston was away at the time, learned about what happened on the phone, and immediately dropped everything to return to his beloved wife. After a long period of rehabilitation, the mobility of the limbs never returned. The disease has severely distorted her speech. All that mattered to Winston was that his wife was alive. But it seemed to Mary that such an existence could not be called life. Winston treated her like a child. He was increasingly annoyed with her. At some point she was very distant, refused to accept his help, so it was necessary to hire a nurse. In rare moments, when Mary's mood improved, he went into her room and read her long Arabian fairy tales. The woman would cry. Winston was confused. He realized that he was completely helpless in this situation. He even tried to go to a psychologist to establish a relationship with his wife, but everything was to no avail. Mary did not want to be a burden, so she gradually faded away. This went on for 10 years. And then one morning, 6th September 2012, Winston, as usual, went into the bedroom of his wife to say good morning, but was horrified to find her dead. Mary had drifted off to sleep. Her face was calm and even somehow happy. After hearing of his mother's death, Alex returned. The funeral was lavish. Say goodbye to Mary came all her former colleagues, numerous friends. Winston, however, the death of his beloved undermined. The man withdrew into himself, stopped all contact with society. He was horrified to realize that together with Mary went that part of him that made him enjoy every day. His son begged the old man to go with him to the capital, but for Winston such a thing was unacceptable. He took an interest in floriculture, began to grow in indoor greenhouses, his late wife's favorite flowers, lavender. And every year he carried fragrant bouquets to her grave. The old man sighed heavily as he finished his story. Joyce could see that the memories were causing him unbearable pain. She's been gone 10 years now. But I hope every time I hear her voice again, he said. I know what it's like, Joyce replied. My story, though not as romantic, is that when my husband left, my world literally turned upside down. For 4 years now I've been trying to cope with the loss, but I still can't get used to the fact that he's gone. Joyce, Winston said to her, thank you for listening to the old man's story. You're the first person I've been able to talk to so easily in 10 years. And, I'm relieved. Winston, this date, the 6th of September, is a fateful date, Joyce said thoughtfully. Did you meet Mary on that day? She fell ill and died on the same date. My husband died on the 6th of September, and you and I met on the same date. Don't you find that odd? I don't know, my dear, said the old man. I don't believe in mysticism, but I can't help thinking that maybe there is a connection. Winston, Joyce suddenly suggested, come and visit us on Sunday. It's my son's birthday. I'd love for you to meet the children, Joyce said. She felt sorry for the lonely old man, trapped in this huge flat, alone with his memories of his wife. She liked him very much, so she thought it was appropriate to invite him to the family party. I don't know, Winston replied uncertainly. Would I be in the way? Not at all. Joyce was quick to reassure him. Of course not. You're such an interesting man. I think it would be nice for you and my children to get to know each other, and you and I have a lot to talk about. Honestly, I can't stand to see you lonely. Please come. All right, the old man laughed in reply. I will. From then on, Winston became a frequent visitor to the Joyce family's flat. The children immediately fell in love with the elegant and talkative grandfather, who had stories for every occasion. They listened for hours about his expeditions, traveling to other countries. Often Winston invited them to his house. Catherine was captivated by the old man's library. Together with Elizabeth, they read French fairy tales, looking at ancient engravings depicting the stories. Grandfather, otherwise they did not call Winston, spoilt the children with sweets, showed the outlandish things brought by him from foreign trips. Joyce was happy to have such a friend in the family. They chatted constantly with Winston over coffee, discussing everything that could come to mind. As a conversationalist, the old man was unrivaled. He literally knew everything about everything. Gradually, Joyce got rid of the heavy burden of the past. One weekend, Winston came to visit and immediately took Joyce aside. Joyce, he began. We've been in touch for a long time, and I'm amazed at how much my life has been enriched by having someone so close to me in it. I can see how hard it must be for you to raise these wonderful children alone. Tell me honestly, are you happy with your life? I don't understand you, Winston. Joyce replied with embarrassment. Of course I'm content. I have beautiful children, a roof over my head, and now I've got a friend like that. I can't complain, can I? That's a good answer. Joyce smiled the old man. But that's not what I mean, Winston continued. Let me get this straight. Do you have enough to live on? Joyce opened her mouth, not knowing what to say. They had never discussed material matters. Well, Winston knew that she worked as a manager in a small firm. She'd never disclosed her salary, but it wasn't hard to guess that it was barely enough to support such a large family. The flat was in treacherous need of repairs. The car was literally screaming for emergency assistance. But did it matter? Joyce, Winston continued seriously, you may not say anything, but I'm not a fool. I can see this isn't easy for you. And frankly, it's a shame to see such a talented and versatile man wasting away in a hopeless job. That's why I have something to offer you. I've been talking to some of my old mates. Tell me, would you be interested in working in your specialty? What do you mean? Joyce was surprised. What do you mean? As a translator. Joyce, come on. There's a big company looking for a French translator. It's a prestigious job. It's a branch of a well-known French pharmaceutical company. Believe me, you'll be hired. I've already forgotten the language, Joyce mumbled embarrassedly. It's nothing, Winston hastened to reassure her. You speak perfectly well. You don't even have an accent. I know what I'm talking about. If you agree, come to the interview tomorrow. It's more of a formality, but you have to come and get acquainted. You can start work right away. Winston, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. If you're serious, of course I'll do it. What time tomorrow? Hang on, Joyce. Tomorrow's the 6th of September. Joyce was really enjoying her new job. She had to socialize with interesting people and regularly fly to France to accompany her boss. She had been in her position for 2.5 years. During this time, it turned out to be possible to establish a life. The children were transferred to a prestigious school. The eternal material problems fell away somehow by themselves. Even in her personal life, there was a shift. Joyce finally let Albert go, and one of her colleagues had a clear sympathy for her, which, to Joyce's surprise, turned out to be mutual on her part. One day her phone rang in the middle of the night, waking her from sleep. She did not immediately understand the meaning of what she heard. A familiar voice announced that Winston had passed away today. The old man had gone quietly, his heart stopping in his sleep. Joyce wept. Over the past few years, this elderly man had managed to become a true friend to her, even more a family man. But his passing had not caused hysteria. She was glad that at last this man would meet his beloved somewhere in heaven, where he stubbornly refused to believe with his mind, but recognized with his heart. Joyce helped with the funeral arrangements. Rummaging through the flat, she found a letter addressed to her, which Winston had apparently written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she unsealed the envelope. Joyce pulled out a neatly written piece of paper. My dear Joyce, I didn't want to upset you prematurely, but I feel like I don't have much time left. I'm glad that at the end of my days, life has turned color again. Both you and your children are a real miracle. I have tried to do my best to help you deal with whatever has been keeping you from breathing fully. I want that from now on you have everything so that nothing will prevent you from developing and loving life. So please accept my humble gift for James and Elizabeth, because I know that for yourself you will refuse. With sincere respect and love for you. Winston. Joyce ran her hands over the sheet, not understanding what Winston meant. She was both happy and sad to receive such a message from him after he had gone. Soon Joyce forgot about the letter and plunged headlong into the abyss of everyday life. What was her surprise when 6 months later she received a call from the notary inviting her to attend the reading of Winston's will. At the appointed hour, the 6th of September, the woman entered the office, where she was informed that the last will of the deceased was to bequeath his flat to James, Elizabeth and Catherine Jones, and the library stored in it their mother Joyce Harrison.